Hey,
Hey, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Doing okay. I'm just printing out the PowerPoint. Hold on, I'll be right back.
Oh, they're posted already?
They did post the one for this week, yeah.
Shoot, I just checked. My printer is out of ink and it hasn't come yet. That's so annoying. Oh, there's week 3. Okay.
Oh my god, it's a hefty one. There's like 28 pages.
No.
Excuse me.
Oh no.
Excuse me.
It doesn't sound good. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's actually, I feel a lot better than I did 2 days ago, so I'm happy.
Oh, that's good. Oh my God, there's a lot of files here. Yikes.
I know. This is very slowly printing. Come on, printer.
Okay, PDF to PowerPoint for sure. Ugh, I'm gonna have to be on my monitor. Damn it.
All right, there we go. Okay. Did you finish the homework?
I did, yeah. The only thing is I can't get my R marked down. I mean, I just copy and pasted my script into the homework, but I can't sorry, I can't get my R marked down to work for some reason, which is super annoying.
That is annoying. I actually did the R markdown for the first time ever, which was wild, but I just screenshotted
Can I
my
lose you for a
code.
second?
Yeah.
Oh wait. Mm. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hmm.
Shoot. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hmm.
Okay. I can't hear anything. Hold on.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? All right, good. So we won't have the same problem as last week. That's good. So also, if for some reason when I start advancing the slides, hey, when I start advancing the slides, if for some reason it doesn't advance, because that also sometimes happens, let me know right away, okay? Just scream out and I will change the setting because otherwise it'll also be recorded. Well, A, you won't be able to see, but B, it'll also be recorded wrong. That was my first week problem. My second week problem was sound. Third week's going to be a charm, right? All right, cool. So, and are we recording? Let's see. Yeah, we are recording. Cool. All right. Now, let's see. EPSY week 3. Uh-oh. 3. This. Week 3. 3. Paste. Replace. Okay, great. So I think we're ready. Let me get my PowerPoint. Okay. And oh, wait, hold on. I gotta share screen. Share, share, share. Share content. I think I want screen 1. I think that's right. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Cool. All right. Hey, welcome back. Week 3. I feel confident this time when I record. We're going to get sound and pictures and PowerPoints. We'll see. Oh, third time's a charm. Okay. So, we have a fair amount to cover today. We didn't get to contextual models last week. So we'll start by sort of reviewing a bit about what we talked about last week, and we'll talk about contextual models. And then our big sort of conceptual new topic for today is centering in multi-level models. And there's actually quite a bit to say about centering in multi-level models. You've probably all done centering for regression models, right? Yeah, okay. But it's just sort of the same kind of idea, but just a lot more complexity to think about in terms of centering in multi-level models. So I'll have more to say about that as we go on, but I think I'll just say this to kind of ease your fears. You are not going to understand everything that I say and everything there is to know about centering at the deepest possible level today. And you need to accept that and be forgiving of yourself. It's one of those topics that's like, on one hand, it has to be covered right up front because it's so essential to everything we do. We need to center our variables and we need to be able to interpret accordingly. And so, I mean, and there's a part of it that, should come relatively easily, but it's an unbelievably sort of deep and complex well. And just to kind of give you an idea about that, I mean, again, centering, seems like a pretty basic topic, but just in the last couple of years alone, there have been, I don't know, 2 or 3 articles, basically just articles explaining how to do centering, how to think about and understand centering in multi-level models in Psychological Methods, which is the top journal in our field. That's I'll tell you honestly, I've never had an article in Psych Methods yet. Been rejected multiple times. I joke with Dave Kenny that I'm like his jinx because I think the only times he's ever been rejected from Psych Methods were the papers that he co-authored with me, which is kind of sad, but I think it might be true. Anyway, top journal. And they're publishing articles on how to think about centering, right? So it's people like me reading these journals going, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, right? And I've been doing this stuff for 20 years. So, it's one of those topics that yeah, you're going to need to know something about it. No, some of it is not going to you're going to understand the basics, but if you think you understand everything about centering after this talk, then you're probably wrong, honestly. So, but, and you'll just settle into it, you will. But so anyway, I just kind of say that as a caveat. So there'll be basic things you'll understand, and there'll be other things that will wash over you a little bit that will you'll eventually sort of settle into the discomfort. I've been listening to this podcast actually, and this therapist, I don't know, I haven't done this, but she was saying, once a week when she takes a shower, she turns the water on cold and just lets the discomfort settle over her. And this is actually good for you to settle into your discomfort. So think of centering as the cold shower of multi-level modeling. You're going to settle into the discomfort of centering. Again, some of it will be obvious. Some of it will be a little bit less obvious. You don't have to worry about the less obvious points for the homework. You just need to understand the more obvious points for the homework. Okay. All right. Having said that, let's get started. All right. So, oh, hey, Chloe and Sarah, can you see this next slide? Yeah?
I can see it.
Good. Okay, great. All right. So again, just a couple kind of points to review. So when we're talking about fixed and random effects, when we're talking about fixed effects, we're really talking about like a slope coefficient or an intercept, right? That's held constant across the clusters. So a fixed effect is we have one, right? So remember, and a good sort of a good hint that we have a fixed effect is that you'll see that we have subscripts, but we don't actually have any letters in those subscripts, right? So for example, gamma naught naught is a fixed effect, or gamma 1 naught is a fixed effect. We just have, one estimate across, for that parameter across the, or for that across the entire sample. A random effect is a slope coefficient or an intercept that's allowed to randomly vary across the level 2 units or clusters. So, we've been talking about randomly varying intercepts. I think last week we talked about random coefficients models. So we started to talk about, did they all print? Woohoo! Randomly varying slopes, right? And so now we're talking about, okay, we've added that U term. We've got a U sub naught J for the randomly varying intercept, or a U sub 1J for the randomly varying slopes, right? And then remember that those random effects are really residuals, right? So we have a sort of a residual for each of our clusters, but then what we're really going to be interested in, the parameter that we're going to estimate in our model actually is the variance component. It's the variance of the randomly varying intercepts, right? We're going to estimate a variance for that. That's tau naught naught. We're going to estimate a variance for the randomly varying slopes. That's tau 1 1. And I've got some slides on the tau matrix later, but generally we're going to allow that tau matrix to be unstructured, which means we're going to allow for covariances among the randomly varying intercepts and randomly varying slopes, which again, we'll talk more about that. Here, I really just wanted to say we've got fixed effects and we've got random effects, right? And just remember, like in 2-level models, level 2 predictors can really only have fixed effects. At the highest level, you really only have fixed effects, right? It's at the level 1 that predictors can be fixed, non-randomly varying, or randomly varying. So fixed would mean, if I can draw on this, hold on. J, let's say, sub naught J plus, I don't even have a predictor in here right now, just for simplicity. But now I've got beta sub naught J. And remember, if I say beta sub naught J is equal to gamma naught naught, I don't put, it's over here, I don't put a U sub naught J there. So I'm not allowing for a residual. Then this intercept is fixed, right? I mean, again, this would be a really dumb model because this would be like a regression model without even a predictor, right? Right now, the way I've written it, so it's literally like a regression model where I'm just estimating one intercept for the whole sample. That's really, you probably didn't even do a model that simple in regression because you just estimate the mean. Right? It's a pretty dumb model, but this is fixed, right? Yeah. Well, it's fixed because we're not, right? This is a fixed effect and I don't have a U sub naught J. So I'm not allowing, so I'm saying there's only one intercept across the whole sample, and I'm not allowing each school's or each cluster's intercept to vary from that intercept. So, is it necessarily the mean? Well, in this case, it would be the mean because I don't have any other predictors, right? So in the case where there are absolutely no other predictors, then yes, it's going to be the mean. But it's not necessarily going to be the mean in general in models. We talk about it as the intercept because, right, it's when everything else in the model is 0. And of course, there's nothing else in the model here. So then, it's going to be the expected value when everything in the model is 0. And the expected value is like a fancy statistical way of saying the mean. But again, think of it yeah, here it'll be a mean, but think of it in general as being your intercept, right? Because, okay, so this is the fixed effect, and I have, this is now, right, this is now like fixed. I don't have, I have no random variation. If I do this, right, now I'm saying, okay, remember, or now I'm saying, yeah, beta sub naught j is a function of the overall intercept. Again, which in this case is a mean, but not always. The overall intercept, plus I'm allowing for there to be there's a deviation of each cluster from the overall intercept. So you can kind of imagine that, like, let's say that this is the didn't change color. Well, that's fine. So let's say that this is the overall mean set, right? Say this is gamma not. But then each school or each cluster could deviate from this overall average, right? So you might have some school, let's say their mean is up here, right? And so their deviation is really, they're a bit above the overall mean. And you can have another school, right? Let's say their mean is down here. And so they're actually deviating, right? They've got a negative residual. And you can sort of imagine if this is the average, we would actually, have this start doing this on one dimension, right? So you can sort of imagine that you have clusters that have sort of, cluster means that are deviating from that overall mean. When I don't have this in the model, I'm not allowing for that, right? I'm saying every cluster, right, is basically they're all sort of a function of this overall intercept, right? But now I put this in, and now I'm saying, okay, I don't just, I've got an overall intercept, but then each intercept can randomly vary from the overall intercept, right? That's randomly varying. So, so a level 1 predictor, like an intercept at level intercept, right, can be fixed, non-randomly varying, or randomly varying. So we talked about fixed and we talked about randomly varying. What's non-randomly varying? Well, what if I do something like this? Well, first thing about non-randomly varying is if it's randomly varying, it's going to have a U. So take that out. Non-randomly varying. But what if I said every school's intercept is a function of that sector, right? And it's a function of mean SES. And it's a function of, I don't know, what else could school achievement be a function of?
I don't, that's really hard to come up with off the top of my head.
It's a function of, I don't know.
Whether it's a gifted school or not.
Okay, there you go. Whether it's a gifted school.
Mean achievement would be affected by that.
Yeah, well, mean achievement seems cheaty, right? Because it'd be like your achievement is a function of your mean achievement. Like, let's say like it's a function of, how about like the principal's leadership?
There you go. That's better.
Okay, some sort of leadership, something. I don't know what the variable is, but
Years of experience of the.
oh, those are always lousy predictors. Yeah, my opinion on years of experience is a variable. It's like, have you ever heard that there's this old, sort of an old, I don't know, joke or saying or something. It's called like the drunken something. Anyway, the basic gist of it is there's this drunk guy and he's looking for his keys under a big street light, right? This policeman comes along and he says, what are you looking for? My keys. Okay, so the policeman's helping him try to find his keys. And then after a while, the policeman says, like, so you lost your keys around here? And he says, no, I lost them over there, but I'm looking here because this is where the light is. Which I don't know. I think about that all the time when I'm doing modeling because, that's a perfect, years of experience is a perfect example of that. It's like sometimes the easiest variables to collect are pretty bad. They're bad. They're about as valuable, like the time, so okay, we can collect them because they're easy. But my experience has been that they do better for principals, but for teachers, years of experience is a pretty lousy predictor, probably partially because it's not linear, right? It's not linear. That's the first problem because, if you have no years or if you have a ton of years, that's probably worse than being in the middle. Yeah. But even otherwise, I mean, it's just not a great predictor. Anyway, I digress. So here we go. Here's my model. Notice I have no U, right? So it's not randomly varying because to be randomly varying, I need a U, but it isn't fixed either. It's non-randomly varying because the intercept is now a function of these other things. So different schools will have different, right? Will have different beta, not J's, but there is no U term. They're sort of deterministic in the sense that it's going to be this linear function of, the overall intercept. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on.
I hate those.
I know. It's too smart for me. Okay.
Can you repeat that last point?
Yeah. So, which was my last point? I got distracted by the.
It's
Okay. So anyway, it's non-randomly varying. It's not randomly varying. So what I was going to say is, so this beta sub naught J, think about it. If you think about beta sub naught J as being this thing that you could observe in each school, right? Beta sub naught J is no longer the same for every school. Remember in my example where I just had beta sub naught J is equal to gamma naught naught. Basically, that's like saying the beta naught for school 1 is gamma naught naught. The beta naught for school 2 is gamma naught naught. The beta naught for school 3 is gamma naught naught, right? So every school has the same beta naught J. So yeah, I could produce a beta naught J, but it's going to be the same beta naught J for every single school. When I add in the beta naught J, when I add in the U naught J, I'm allowing for that residual for every school. So that's like unexplained. That's the piece that I can't explain with whatever else is in my model. In the intercept only model that I gave an example of, it's basically your deviation from the overall intercept, which again would be your deviation from the overall mean in that scenario, but not always. But here, the beta naught sub J's are going to differ by J, right? Because like some schools are going to be public schools and some schools are going to be private schools or Catholic schools. Some schools are going to differ in terms of their mean SES. This is a continuous variable. So you could imagine that, there are lots of different values here for mean SES. Let's say leadership style, that might also be a continuous variable. So you can imagine like this, again, imagine that this is like a regression, right? This is like the school's predicted like intercept now. The school predicted intercept is a function of the overall intercept plus whatever the coefficient for sector times whatever sector they are, plus the coefficient for mean SES times whatever the mean SES of the school is, plus the coefficient for leadership times leadership, whatever their score on leadership is, right? But I say it's deterministic in the sense that I don't actually have an error term here at level 2. That's what non-randomly varying means. So I do actually get different beta naught J's, but they're a function of whatever these level 2 variables are, and I'm not allowing for a residual at level 2. So I'm not allowing for there to be random variability in those intercepts over and above sort of what I've predicted with these things in my model. Now, if I do this, by the way, and I don't have a use of not J, let's say this is my model. Do I need to run a multi-level model to fit this? Yeah, I mean, I've sort of set it up as a 2-level model, but really if I do my substitution, right, if I substitute in for beta naught J, all of this stuff, then I'm going to get, right, y sub I J is equal to gamma naught naught plus gamma naught 1 times sector plus gamma naught 2 times mean SES plus gamma naught 3 times leadership plus R sub ij. And yes, it's true that those might be slightly different symbols than you used in multiple regression, but that follows the format of a multiple regression model. So in that scenario, you wouldn't actually need a multi-level model, because again, the multi-level like the essence of sort of what we can do in multi-level modeling that we can't do anywhere else is really have this much more complex variance, error variance covariance structure, residual variance covariance structure. So in this case, if this were really your model, you wouldn't actually need a multi-level model. And actually, in point of fact, sometimes you might start out with a model where, you've got this ICC that's 0.2 and there's like a lot of random variability in the intercepts. But, if you actually had a really good set of predictors and you were able to plug in a whole bunch of really good predictors, sometimes you might find that after you put in all of your predictors that you no longer, this doesn't happen that often, honestly. You kind of wish it would, but it doesn't usually. But let's just imagine it could happen that after you plug in this really good set of predictors, that you discover that even though, like, when you didn't have any predictors in, you did have a lot of between school variability. But once you added in all of these really good predictors, you've actually explained the between school variability, right? And so you no longer need this U. And then in that case, like, you would get to a point where, yeah, you started off doing this multi-level model, but like your final model is not actually a multi-level model at all because you don't have any U's. So in that case, it's really just a regular regression model. But anyway, so we can have randomly varying coefficients or we can have non-randomly varying coefficients. And I showed it here for an intercept, but the same thing holds true for slopes, for those, beta 1 sub 1 J's. I will say this, I think it's more common to get to a point where you might not need the U for a slope coefficient after you add predictors than it is to find that you don't need the U for the intercept. So it's not that uncommon to end up with a scenario where you have a non-randomly varying slope, partially because the slopes are just noisier to begin with. So there's some of that. Okay.
Remind us.
Oh, how the U is related, how I know?
Yeah.
So it's, okay. So I've got a U, and the first thing is going to be a number, right? And that really indexes what the U goes with. So U naught is always going to be the U for the intercept, right? U1 is going to be the U for the first slope. U2 is going to be the U for the second slope if you have two randomly varying slopes. And then the second thing that we have, again, this is just for two level model. The second piece, that J, is just indicating, oh, I have one of these residuals for each of my J clusters, right?
But isn't it true that a lot of times when you read stuff, it doesn't have the J? Like it'll just have the number.
Yeah.
They leave off.
Yeah,
so it can be confusing.
Yeah, sometimes that is true. Sometimes, and you'll see that the notation varies widely from book to book and article to article for this stuff. I know it's really annoying. Even within like the social, like even within the sort of psyche and psyche behavioral sciences literature, it varies a lot. And then if you move over to like econ or stat, I would say you need like a Rosetta Stone. It's like, tell me what Greek, you're using that Greek letter for this, and oh my God. So that can be annoying. And yeah, sometimes you might see that people might drop the subscripts just for simplicity. Yeah. What R is?
Yeah.
Sure. So it's the within. So the I says every person within a cluster, right? So this is person I in cluster J. And just to go kind of back to this sort of, boy, this is ugly, but just to go kind of back to what we were talking about here. Imagine that this is school J, right? And now I've got, I wish I had different colors. I've got person I in school J, right? And so the R sub ij is really capturing how far person I in school J is from their own clusters intercept, right? So you can sort of imagine again that, we're really you're sort of taking this person, right? and you're saying like, how far is this person like from their schools, right? From their schools, whatever. So, and then how far is their school from like the overall intercept? Right? And it doesn't have to always be going that direction, right? This person could be higher, let's say, than their school's mean. So it's really, so this is really capturing, you know, we've got a beta not J for each cluster. How far, like, you know, well, actually, it's not just the beta not J. It's going to be the whole, you know, it's the whole equation, right? But once we've kind of plugged in the entire predictive equation, all the non-randomly varying stuff, like this visual is how far are you from your predicted score, the score that would be predicted, again, in the unconditional model, it's really easy because it's just like, you know, you from your school and your school from the overall. But in the more general sense, it's really, I've predicted a score for you, just like I do in a multiple regression, right? I predicted a score for you, and it's once I've predicted a score for you, how far are you from your predicted score? And it's how far is person I in cluster J, how far are they from their predicted score? But their predicted score is going to be a function of like their cluster, right? What's going on? Because if those coefficients are randomly varying by cluster, right, they're going to have different coefficients because they belong in cluster J, this cluster, then maybe this person has different coefficients because they're in another, you know, cluster, right? That's exactly right. There's no R related to slope. R is always about the deviation of this person from their predicted value, just like it is in regular regression. All right, good. I know it's a lot of notation, a lot of notation. Okay, so just to remind ourselves, so for this random coefficients model, right, what we're really doing, and again, random coefficients model, if I say random coefficients model, that means some slope is randomly varying, not just the intercept, right? So random coefficients model means I've got a randomly varying, I mean, I guess technically you could have a random coefficients model where the intercept doesn't vary and the slope does, but that's pretty unusual. So much more commonly, like a random coefficients model, you have a randomly varying intercept, which is right here, and you've got a randomly varying slope, right? And we can see that because we've got the U sub naught J and we've got the U sub 1J, right? And again, just to remind ourselves that we can plug, right, beta, we're saying beta sub naught J is a function of gamma naught naught, the overall intercept, plus U sub naught J. So we can plug that in here. And beta sub 1J is a function of gamma 1 naught, which is the intercept for the slope, okay? Plus U sub 1J, which is, again, the residual for the slope. And then we can plug, you know, it's like, and how far does the cluster, right? Sort of the cluster slope deviate from the overall intercept for the slope. Then we can plug that in for beta 1J. And it's when we do that substitution that we see that we can get rid of our betas. And now we can sort of re-express the whole model as a function of gammas and U's. And notice here, right, so we've got gamma naught naught plus U sub naught J. That's the first thing I substituted in. And now I've got, notice here, this is all being plugged in for beta 1J. So I'm actually multiplying this whole thing by x sub ij, right? So what I end up getting is gamma 1 naught times x sub ij, right? Plus, and this is the part that might seem weird at first, but it's U sub 1J times x sub ij, because again, we're plugging this whole thing in and we're multiplying that, right, by x sub ij. So if you think about it, it's gamma 1 naught times x sub ij plus U1J. Oh, I did it again. U1J, I'm going to do that a lot. I'm sorry. U1J times x sub ij. So that is why we have this term, which really says, if you think about it, right? This residual is getting multiplied by X. Yeah. Yeah, it's X by J. So it's individual I score on that variable. So like for our example with SES that we're going to keep using again today. So every person in the sample has an SES score, right? And so literally this is of 1J. That differs by cluster, it differs by school. So it's each school is going to have a different value there, right? So we're going to plug in like school J's U basically times each individual's X sub ij. That's right. So when we see ij, it's really individual I in cluster J. And J is the cluster. Yeah. It's the intercept for the slope. Is it the average slope? It depends on what else is going on in the model, right? So I think that's a really important point. So most generally, it's good to think about it as the intercept for the slope, which means it's the expected slope when everything else in the model is 0. Now, in this particular situation, I don't actually have any predictors, right? But so it is going to be basically like the average slope here, but that's not always going to be the case, right? And it also what average, which we're going to get to when we talk about centering. But for now, I will leave that alone because we haven't gotten there. But yeah, most generally, I think it's best to think about this as being the intercept for the slope, which is the predicted slope when all the other predictors are 0. And then you ask yourself, okay, in this model, what does it mean for all of the other predictors to be 0? Are there predictors? How are they coded or centered? And then you go through that little game in your head, and then that will tell you how to interpret that. But it is the intercept for the slope. Yeah. Yes, and look, we have our taos. How handy. So the tau is of the U, right? So again, going back to our model, I've got like a beta sub naught J, gamma naught plus U naught J. So this U sub naught J is saying, how much does this cluster's intercept? How much does it deviate from the overall intercept? And again, in the unconditional model, I can think about it as how much does this cluster's mean overall mean? But in general, it's intercept to intercept. Okay. So this is really capturing, this is a residual, but it's like a residual at the cluster level, right? Okay, that's not the parameter, though, that we estimate in our model. The parameter that we're actually going to estimate in the model is the variance of this thing. I want to know, and that's very similar too. Like if you think about regression, we get residuals for each person, but we don't actually have those residuals for each person aren't like a parameter in our model. We can get those. We can and we will do that too. We can report out those residuals for each person, right? It's the deviation of their score from whatever their model predicted score is. But like each person's residual is not a parameter in the model, right? What's a parameter in what's the parameter in the regression model? It's actually the residual variance, right? It's we can take the variance of the residuals, and that gives us, that variance of U sub naught J, that is tau naught naught. So I think people often get really confused about this because we talk about random effects a lot, but then when we move into the models, what we're actually looking at when we look at the parameters in the model, and what we're really actually most interested in are the variances in those residuals, right? So the variances in the random effects all make up our tau matrix. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Yes, Claudia.
Make them change, like balance of U is a balance of U, the whole model. it's just one number. So I'm just very confused. Is it because if the random effect, but the table was just one number and represent the
It is one number, but it's representing the variability of those residuals, right? Because it's random effects because we're allowing this thing to randomly vary across schools. So again, each school has potentially their own U sub naught J. But then when we want to actually try to, because again, whenever we're doing modeling, we're trying to we got all this data, we got all these like U's, right? We got all this stuff. But the model, we're going to pull it all together and try to kind of sort of talk about summarize it in some sense. And so this has a variance, right? And that's actually what we're estimating in the model is how much again, in this case, how much do schools vary from the overall mean, right? So each school has a U sub naught J, theoretically, each school has a U sub naught J, and then we're gonna what's the variance of those U sub naught J's, right? That's really what tau naught naught is. And this is sort of like, again, well, we'll get to this later on, but this is like the true between school variance in the whatever intercepts in this case, right? Or in this case, again, we don't have anything, so we could even think about it as the true between school variance in the means. And this, but again, remember, it's true that we only have one tau naught naught for each model, but all the taus are going to change as we build our models, right? And we're going to be looking at how those variance components change as we go across models. So that's going to be that's also a really important point. Yeah? Okay. Any last questions about any of this? Yes?
So that's basically
Exactly. This variance is telling us how much between school, like how much variability is there in the schools, like the deviation of the schools, right? How much do schools vary from the overall mean? That's exactly right. So we talk about this as being like the between school variance in the intercepts, or in this case, the between school variance in the means, right? Yes. That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. So tau 1,1 is the variance in the under there. It says the variance in U sub 1J, and then tau naught 1 is the covariance between U sub naught J and U sub 1J. So those residuals could be correlated. So like if you think about, let's just say, again, let's say we're talking about SES slope, right? So it could be that schools that have higher intercepts also tend to have steeper SES slopes, right? That would kind of give you a positive covariance between, and I actually have some pictures of that, so I'll show that in a second. But so the tau 1 naught is really, or tau naught 1, depending on which one you say, is the covariance between the slope and the intercept, which I would say is generally of less. I mean, sometimes it's of great interest in organizational models. Sometimes you're not that interested in that component. But in longitudinal models, it's pretty much always interesting, because in a longitudinal model, it's going to end up being the correlation between the intercept is depending on how you code it, but often we'll code it for where people start. And then the slope will be how fast they grow. And if you're doing some sort of a developmental study, you usually do want to know what's the correlation between where people start and how fast they grow. So do people who start out higher, do they grow faster or slower than people who start out lower, right? So I always find that like the longitudinal example is an easier way sort of to get your head around what this covariance means, because often organizationally, like I can tell you what it means, but you're like, well, I don't think I ever cared about that. And that's fair. Sometimes maybe you didn't, but that's what that is.
There's a lot of things I didn't care about till I listened to you.
Hey, that's right. That's right. You should care. But no, I mean, I would say for organizational models, you know, sometimes people don't even report, I mean, they may estimate those covariances, not even report them or whatever, because they're just not that interested. But, you know, yeah, you probably should be, right? I'm going to tell you, you should be interested. Actually, I will also say sometimes it's really hard to get a good, maybe you shouldn't be interested, because I'm also going to talk to you like next week about how hard it can be to get a good sort of a good precise estimate of that number. So before you interpret it, you want to make sure you have a decent degree of precision. So, but conceptually, that's what it is. Yes. Yeah, but that's just because the way, yes, these are the same, absolutely the same. It's just the indexing, right? So this is saying like not means the covariance of like, right, intercept with intercept, which is the variance of the intercept. This is like covariance of slope with slope, which is the variance of the slope. And this is saying covariance of intercept with slope. And this is saying covariance of slope with intercept. And these are covariance matrices, which are always symmetric, right? So above the diagonal and below the diagonal, those off diagonals are going to match. But it's just flipped because, you know, like the covariance between variable 1 and 2 versus the covariance between variables 2 and 1. But that's still going to be the same thing at the end of the day, right? Yeah. Yes. So we're actually really only, if you think about it, then we're estimating 3 parameters here for our variance components, not 4, right? And also not 2. People often think it's 2 because like I've got a u sub naught j, I've got a u sub 1j, but if I'm allowing those 2 to covary, then I'm actually estimating 3 variance components at level 2. I've still got the variance of r sub ij, which is my sigma squared, right? So I've really got 4 variance components and then plus however many fixed effects I have in my model. That's going to be the number of parameters I'm estimating. But if you could, it says 4 variance components plus the fixed effects is going to be the number of parameters we're estimating in the model. Yes. Yeah, everything should be, so when you get the output from R, if you say summary of your model, for example, you're going to get everything you need. It's going to give you the variances for, it's going to give you sigma, it's going to give you sigma squared, it's going to give you the variances for your level 2, right, for your U's. So it's going to give you your taus if you have you have a slope variance and you've specified it as an unstructured model, which we will. It'll give you the covariance. The one thing that it does that's a little weird is it's going to give you the covariance as a correlation, not as a covariant. I don't know if that's weird or not. Maybe it's helpful. Maybe it would be nice if it gave you, in summary, it will give you both the variances and the standard deviations, right? But when it gives you this thing, it's only going to give it as a correlation. I mean, if you really wanted it as a covariance, you could compute that. And it's pretty hard to interpret covariances, so maybe that's not a big deal. But that's the only thing that you won't get. You'll get only the standardized covariance. Like if you did this in HLM, you get the opposite. You'd only get the covariance and you'd have to compute the correlations. Different programs. But yeah, everything will be there on the output. Well, not a value for what your u sub 0, not your u, not j. Because remember, like in our example, we've got 160 schools, so we've got 160 u sub naught j's. What I'm interested in is the variance in that u sub naught j, and that's what tau naught naught is, and that will be on the output. I am going to show you in like next week or the week after, sometime soon, I'll show you how to actually get all of the u sub naught j's for all of the schools. Like you.
Just to be clear, like if you look under random effects and it lists the things, that's where you should be looking.
Yeah, it says random effects, but they're actually the variances of the random effects. And be careful of that because people are sometimes, even software packages are sometimes sloppy in their language. So technically, this is the random effect and tau is.
Just do it again. Oh, that's not either one.
No, that's not either one. Okay, let me go back for a second. So technically, the U's are the random effects, and the variances of the random effects and the, or the variance covariance matrix for those random effects is actually, those are our variance components. And that's what we're going to get out of the software package. But sometimes you'll hear people talk, like shorthand, they'll talk about random effects. And sometimes they'll be meaning like the U's, and sometimes they'll be meaning the variances of the U's. I try to be really careful in my language in this class, but I might even slip up sometimes. Because, and you'll definitely see people sort of use the term random effect sometimes synonymously with the variance of the random effect, but technically the random effect is this guy, and it's the variance of the random effect that we're getting. That's the parameter of interest. Just like we have residuals in a regression model, but it's the variance of the residuals. That's the sigma squared. That's the thing of interest. Yeah.
Could you say again about what you just wrote?
Sure. Which part of what I just wrote?
Some things represented by 4 parameters.
Oh, yeah. So what I was saying is if I want to count the parameters in a model, in the model that I'm estimating, and everybody who's taking SEM with me knows I love to count parameters in models, right? So the number of parameters that you're estimating in your model. So what are considered the parameters you're estimating? They are your fixed effects, which are going to be your gammas. So however many, right? Your gammas, they're not going to have any sub J's in they're going to be like gamma naught, right? It might be gamma naught, gamma 1 naught, gamma naught 1, whatever. So all of your gammas plus however many variance components you're estimating. And your variance components are really going to be your taus plus, you're always going to have this guy. You're always going to have sigma squared, right? You're always going to have this residual within cluster variance. So in this case, like, again, imagine that, I've got some number of fixed effects. It doesn't matter. I've got a model. It's got however many fixed effects, however many gammas. That'll be the first part of what I'm counting, the gammas. Plus the variance components are basically going to be the number of unique elements in the tau matrix, right? Plus sigma squared. And the number of unique elements in the tau matrix is really going to be, right? We're not going to count this because it's like a covariance matrix. So the off diagonal elements are going to be the same above and below. But how many unique elements do we have? 1, 2, 3, right? And so if we've got 3 taus here plus sigma squared. So those are, again, so sometimes this is referred to as 4 variance components because we've sort of taken the overall variance in the outcome variable. And again, this is like, sometimes I step back and I'm just amazed by that. Like, we took this variance in the outcome variable and we basically chopped it into 4 pieces, right? We've got 4 variance components here. Pretty amazing we can do that. Stop and think about it. But anyway, it's residual variance, and now we've got 4 variance components. So here we wanted to count the number of parameters. It would be the number of fixed effects plus the number of variance components, which here would be 3 taus plus a sigma squared. Everything we're doing is 2 levels. Yeah, this would be like a 2-level random coefficients model where we just have one randomly varying slope, right? What if we added, think about this for a minute. What if I added a second randomly varying slope? How many variance components would I have then? Assuming I want to allow for an unstructured tau matrix, which is generally speaking where we're always going to default. We might occasionally do something different, but it's good to estimate an unstructured tau matrix. So if I add another U, right? Think about that. Hold on, let me use some of this. I'm going to have tau 2 now, right? Extend this, right? And then what am I going to have over here? Tau 2 naught, tau 1 2, right? And then this guy is a repeat. This guy is a repeat. That one's a repeat. guess I shouldn't give my repeats genders. Those, right. Those are repeats. So how many elements do I now have in my variance covariance matrix, right? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now I've got 6 taus. And how many variance components am I estimating in total? 7, right? Because I've got 6 taus plus sigma squared. So now I've got 7 variance components. And this is actually, I mean, again, we'll come back to this idea, but this is kind of an interesting and important point too, because let's say I have a randomly varying slope. You know, I've got U, the 2J here, right, is my random effect that I've added for that second slope, whatever it is. And let's say I discover I want to see, maybe I don't need U sub 2J, or I discover I don't need U sub 2J. So like I take this random effect out for the second slope. Now the model that I'm estimating actually has 3 fewer parameters, right? Why? Because as soon as I take this out, I lose this variance and I lose these covariances, right? So that's another sort of tricky thing that we're going to have a much longer conversation about how do we decide what slopes to allow to randomly vary, not today. But like, that's also sort of a consideration in some sense that, or, I mean, well, something, it's not necessarily the thing that's going to drive the boat on making the decision, but something to keep in mind is that as you add random slopes, if you allow for an unstructured tau matrix, you know, this thing is going to blow up, right? I mean, imagine if you had like 10 randomly varying slopes, or let's say 9 randomly varying slopes. If you had 9 randomly varying slopes, how many taus would you be estimating? Well, if you had, I mean, think anybody who's been in SEM class, that should be like, okay, well, wait a minute, if I had 9 randomly varying slopes, I've got 10 U's, right? So I could say 10 times, remember how we estimate the number of unique elements in the variance covariance matrix? Is just, right, we took the number, we took V times V plus 1 divided by 2. So I could use the same logic here. And I could say, okay, if I've got 10 U's, right, I'm going to go 10 times 11 divided by 2, which is actually 55. So if I had a model that had 9 randomly varying slopes and a randomly varying intercept, and I estimate an unstructured, unstructured variance covariance matrix, I'm going to actually estimate a tau matrix with 55 unique elements. Plus, don't forget my little sigma squared that I still have. So I'd actually be estimating 56 variance components, right? And when you do that, then you know what I'm saying about, like, at a certain point, we're going to have to sort of think carefully about this, because you can't just necessarily, you know, sometimes we have these like enormous models in terms of the number of level 1 predictors. You've probably all fit regression models where you've got like 10 level 1, you know, 9 or 10 level 1 predictors or whatever. You can't necessarily by default just be like, I'm in multi-level class now, so just let them all randomly vary and fit an unstructured, you know, tau matrix. Again, I wouldn't recommend letting them all randomly vary and not fitting an unstructured matrix, because that's worse. But like, you know, I always say, like, before you got in this class, you were content with 1 residual variance, and like now you want 56. That's kind of greedy, you know. So you gotta make some decisions at some point. Yeah. And the only thing to just keep in mind is where people get tripped up is, like, think about, you've got a randomly varying intercept. Like, think about this as the number of U's. So you could say like times plus 1 divided by 2. And here I'm just using U to be like the number of random effects that you have in the model, right? Where people sometimes get tripped up is like, if I say, oh, my model has 2 randomly varying slopes, but like implicitly, I'm also thinking I have a randomly varying intercept, then you got to remember it's 3 U's and not 2. Do you know what I mean? But once you remember that it's the number of U's, you can totally use this. It'll give you the number of taus. So like here we have 2 U's, right? So we could go 2 times 2 plus 1 is 3 divided by 2 is equal to 3. And when we had 3, it would be 3 times 4 divided by 2 was 6, and that's exactly what we had. So it works. So like if you only have like, 2 or 3 U's, you probably don't need the formula, but if you've got a beaucoup U's, it's a handy formula to remember. Yeah. The number of U's, the number of random effects, right? So we have a random, so I said, what if we had a randomly varying intercept and 9 randomly varying slopes? So that's 10 U's. Yeah. It's like, that's why I'm going to call it U here. So it's number of U's, number of random effects in the model. And we're going to count for both the intercept and all of the randomly varying slopes. You can also think of it as slopes plus 1. That's right. I mean, assuming you're letting the intercept randomly vary, which is true 99% of the time. But technically, you could have a model where where the intercept doesn't randomly vary, but the slopes do. So like most generally, it's the number of U's, but you will often see people talk about it as the tau matrix as being of magnitude, and I think I even have it on a slide somewhere, Q plus 1, Q being the number of randomly varying slopes plus 1 for the intercept. Which again, just makes the assumption, which is true like almost all the time, that you're allowing the intercept to randomly vary. But technically, you don't have to. Yeah. 10 here in my example was the number of U's. Because I said 9 slopes. I was saying like 9 slopes vary, 9 slopes plus 1 intercept. No, I said 55 is the number of that's like how big the tau matrix is. I guess you could say, well, I mean, I would probably say there are 55 unique elements in my tau matrix is the way I would say it.
Right.
But it is true that there are 55 taus in my tau matrix. 56 variance components, right? There are only 50. Well, I mean, overall, because I mean, again, if you do the matrix manipulation, eventually the sigma squared ends up being part of a larger matrix, but it's not part of the tau matrix, right? Yes, that's where we started. I said, so if you want to count the number of parameters, it's the number of fixed effects, which is the number of gammas, plus the number of unique elements in the tau matrix, plus sigma squared. So that's how you could count the total number of parameters. Yeah.
Both measurement and how much of that tau is affected by the structure scale, ceiling effect, variability, for example, at the top, I would imagine.
Okay.
Different conclusions.
Yeah. So you make some good points, so one thing that I think sort of an important point that you're making is that what if you don't have a lot of variability for one of the random effects, right? So let's say you hit, like, let's say you have like major ceiling effects on this variable or something. So there's very restricted variability in that U. Then think about what that means for the covariances of that U with everything else, right? Because obviously, I mean, let's go again. I always like to think of things in like extreme cases because that just kind of helps me to kind of backpedal and remember it in general. So the most extreme case would be, imagine there's no variability, right? Imagine there's no variability for one of these U's. Then what will the covariance of that U be with all of the other U's? Not one. What? Like think about it, if you look at the correlation, because if you have no variability, then you're really saying you've got a constant, right? What's the correlation between a constant and a variable? Like if everybody's got the same score on one variable, and then I correlate it with another variable, what's the correlation going to be between the variable where everybody's got the same score and the variable where everybody's got different scores? This really wasn't meant to be zero. Yes, I was going to say it's not meant to be a trick question. It's zero, right? So, I mean, that's one of the problems with like ceiling effects, restriction of range, all that kind of thing. Like if you get to a place where you have very, very low variability on a variable, then then obviously it's difficult to get covariation of that variable with something else. Because remember, covariation, covariance. You can't get covariance with something else if it doesn't vary in the first place, right? So yes, so I mean, I think that's an important point. And then I think your point about like, well, I think you sort of started to say something that sort of sounded like how you interpret all of these things, which I think is totally fair. And again, I wouldn't recommend having 55 of them. I was just using this as an example. This was not meant to be like something you should aspire to. In fact, if you put me with a model like this, I would tell you you're crazy. So I was just trying to actually to make the point that if you put in all the random effects, your variance covariance matrix is going to blow up. But the reality is that even if you don't have a good theoretical rationale for looking at the covariances, you know, among these random effects, the truth is that if you constrain them, so if you estimate the variances, so you have a U and you say, I'm going to estimate the variance of U, but I'm going to constrain, let's say I'm going to put in the variance of U, so I'm going to estimate a tau 2. But I want to constrain the covariance of this random effect with the other random effects to be 0, which you could like theoretically do, right? The problem there is that I mean, again, that's a potential really big misspecification of your model. Like if they're not 0, that's problematic. And in fact, often these things are on really different scales and on different metrics. And so it can actually be really problematic to constrain the covariances to be 0. You're in much like, and again, we can test to see if they're 0. So it's much better to default to the unstructured covariance matrix, and you can always sort of dig in later and see if you can simplify that covariance matrix. But it's a bad idea to specify a matrix where you like just by default constrain all of these things to be 0. And in fact, Doug Bates, who's the developer of the LME4 and NLME packages that we'll use in this class, he wrote, I think, did we put the paper about fitting models in LME4 in the R folder? I think I did.
Yes, we did.
Okay, so I did not make this article. It's an article from the Journal of Statistical Software on fitting multi-level models in LME4. It's a nice article. There are parts of it that are really, really like equation-y, which is why I did not make it required reading, because it goes way more deeply into some of the computational stuff than you necessarily need to worry about. But in that article, he actually has like a nice discussion of why using the unstructured tau matrix versus like actually constraining all of these to off-diagonal elements to be 0 is a much better idea. How that can actually cause some misspecification problems that can really lead you astray if you sort of by default make all the off-diagonal elements 0. So even though you might think you don't care about them, you should still allow them to be freely estimated. And it's interesting too, because different software packages have different defaults when it comes to these off-diagonal elements. So if you were using like, if you're using R, like LME4 or NLME, I think NLME is the same way, as I recall, for example, or if you were using HLM, the HLM software package that Rodenbush developed, the default there is to estimate the unstructured tau matrix unless you say otherwise. But if you use Stata, SPSS, or SAS, the default is actually to estimate those off-diagonal elements as 0 unless you say otherwise, interestingly. So different software packages have different defaults, so it's really important for you to know what the defaults are and to be looking at that. At M+ also, I think you'll get an unstructured, I know you will, you'll get an unstructured tau matrix if you do this stuff in M+ as well. So M+, HLM, and R, you're going to get the unstructured matrix. Most of the other, I guess, MLWin. Does anybody use MLWin? Probably not. I mean, not here, but the other, sort of the other three big software packages won't. So if you were to run a model across software packages, you might think you're running the same model because you use the same basic equation. But if you just go with the defaults, you might actually have a very different model in terms of the structure of the tau matrix, which would give you different deviance, would give you different parameter estimates, right? You might be like, I don't get it. Why is this so different? Why does it say I'm estimating fewer parameters? Why is my fit worse? Blah, blah, blah. So, okay, moving along. We ready? Maybe? AIC. Well, the AIC is a function of, and we haven't talked about the AIC yet, but the AIC is a function of deviance plus 2 times the number of parameters. So it'll be a lot bigger than if you only have, if you have fewer parameters. But certainly, I mean, you wait and see, right? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But the AIC is going to be much more a function of it's deviance is going to drive the goal line, which makes it weird because sometimes the AIC looks huge and sometimes the AIC looks small. But of course, in isolation, you can't. Actually, the BIC has a pretty decent correction for parsimony, depending. BIC will favor more parsimonious models. We're going to talk about that later too, because we got to think about sample size. Like, what the heck is the sample size we want to plug into the BIC? So we'll come back to that, I think, next week and talk about the BIC. Okay, onward, upward. Let's get to slide 4. No, 5. We're on slide 4. We count the cover sheet. There we go. All right, so this is just, I did not make this, by the way. I totally ripped this off from an online image search because I'm not that good at making things. But this just kind of shows, again, this idea graphically, fixed intercept and fixed slope versus like a random intercept and fixed slope. So notice right there, the intercepts are allowed to randomly vary, but the slopes are all fixed to the same, right? We're saying that the relationship, in our example, the relationship between SES and math achievement is the same across all schools, but schools might differ in terms of their intercepts, right? We can have random intercepts and random slopes. And I think what's interesting here, and this is kind of, we've talked about sort of these ideas so far. Yeah, thinking about that covariance between the slopes and the intercept. Now here, this is, and I pointed out here, this is a positive slope, okay? So in all these cases, we have a positive slope, something like the relationship between SES and math achievement. But notice, if you have random intercepts and a positive, positive overall slope, right? And this is showing a positive correlation or covariance between the randomly varying intercepts and slopes. So what you see on that picture is that schools with higher intercepts also tend to have steeper slopes, right? That's different actually than getting a negative covariance between the slopes and the intercepts, which is here where we see actually schools with higher intercepts, right? Looking across this line, they tend to have less positive or more negative slopes, right? The slope is positive, but their slope is less positive or more negative than it is down here. And then it could be that there's just pretty much absolutely no relationship between the randomly varying slopes and intercepts, which is kind of what you see on this last slide, right? So, look here, right? It says relatively low intercept with really steep slope. This is a high intercept with a kind of not very steep slope, high intercept, steep slope. They're all over the board, right? So there's no kind of distinguishable pattern there between the slopes and the intercepts. Okay. So that this is really just sort of showing that in sort of a table format. And I'm pointing out here that if you don't have slope variance, that's really what this is saying. If you don't have variance in the slope, find the covariance between only actually gets defined when you. Anyway, okay. Oh, and I don't know why I put it on there again. I probably had reasons, or maybe we just talked about these. We talked about estimated parameters, right? So I feel like, so here where I say there are Q plus 1, Q Q plus one, I shouldn't say, oh yeah, no, that's right, variances. Whew, I didn't say variance components. There are Q plus one variances and as many covariances as there are pairs of effects in the model. So again, this is but an easier way to think about elements in the. Okay. I think we talked about estimated parameters quite a bit, so I'm going to skip through here. Yeah. What are you confused by? Oh, the Q is just standing in for Q is like, I could have just another, it is confusing. It's just more notation to say I could have any number of slopes. So I could have Q slopes. So rather than saying tau naught and tau 1 and tau 2 and tau 3, I'm saying tau naught for the intercept. And then I'm just saying Q could go from 1 to whatever number, right? I could have one slope, in which case I just have tau 1. I could have 4 slopes, in which case tau QQ becomes tau 1 and tau 2 and tau 3 and tau 4. So it's just a really sort of a really general way of saying, sort of talking about what's going on here. So don't let that throw you. I do think that can be, are so many subscripts already. What? Yeah. Well, yeah. I was gonna say, I think some of it, yeah. I try to get most of that in the PowerPoints, but you're right. I should probably write out all of the subscripts more carefully. I mean, I try to, like, that's what the Q sort of says that, but I know it's a lot. Okay. So here we go. Just reminding ourselves about the proportion reduction in variance at level 1 and at level 2. I feel like we've kind of covered this quickly a couple times, and we'll do it again. So the proportion of variance explained at level 1, right? So if I want to know, I put in a predictor generally at level 1, and I want to know how much of the variance at level 1, right? How much of the residual variance within cluster is explained by this predictor or this set of predictors. You could do it for a predictor or for a set of predictors. I just take the sigma squared for that baseline model. So my simpler model. So what?
Oh, it's still up on the.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I take the sigma squared for my baseline model, my simpler model. So for example, I might take, if I add a predictor, I might want to take the sigma squared for my unconditional model minus the sigma squared for the model that has SES in it. That's what we'll do today. And then divide it by the sigma squared for the unconditional model. And that gives me sort of an approximation, right, of like what proportion of variance within cluster variance am I explaining with this level 1 variable? And I can do the same thing, right? Okay, so, and this is just an example that I think we talked about this last time. Actually, I think I meant to take this slide out though, because we're going to do this when we get into R. So I'm going to skip that slide. Because I've got the proportion reduction variance when we get to our markdown. Okay, so intercepts and slopes as outcomes models, also maybe sometimes called contextual models. This is like our most general form of multi-level model. So we've got randomly varying slopes, we've got randomly varying intercepts, and we have explanatory variables at level 2 that we're using to try to explain the variability in the slopes and the variability in the intercepts. So we're using these level 2 variables to try to account for or reduce variance in the intercepts and the slopes, right? Based on whatever characteristics of the cluster that we might have collected. And then in this case too, we're often really interested in looking at these cross-level interactions, which are an interaction of a level 2 variable with a level 1 slope, right? So we want to know, does the effect of some level 2 variable moderate the effect of a level 1 variable on the dependent variable? That's what's meant by cross-level interaction, right? So does the level 2 variable moderate the slope for the level 1 variable? But the slope for the level 1 variable is really telling you about the effect of the level 1 variable on the outcome. So you can really think about that as, does the effect of this level 2 variable moderate the effect of the level 1 variable on the outcome variable? Are you with me? Yeah, I know it's a mouthful. Wait till we get to 3-level models. So anyway, all right. So this is just like a simple example here. So we could have a level 2 variable that we use to predict the intercept and the slope, right? And again, I think we talked about this briefly last time, but I wanted to kind of go back through it again. Let's assume here that SES is grand mean centered or whatever. So we've got a randomly varying intercept. Okay, we've got this. Now I'm really saying, like, can I use sector to predict those randomly varying intercepts? And can I use sector to predict varying slopes? And remember that the variance in this is tau naught naught, right? And the variance in this tau 1 1. So I could ask the same kind of question, like, when I put in sector, how much of the variance in the randomly varying intercept is explained by including sector in my model? So I could imagine taking, like, the tau naught naught from the model that doesn't have sector, right? So I'm going to call that, I'll call that my baseline model now. And I could take the tau naught naught from the model that includes sector. I'm going to call that sector right now. Tau naught naught for the model that includes sector. And I could divide that again by the tau naught naught for whatever for my baseline model. And that's going to give me what proportion of the variance in the intercepts is actually explained by sector, right? But here we've got sector as a predictor of the randomly varying intercepts. We also have sector as a predictor of the randomly varying slopes. Now, you don't have to have the same set of variables in both equations. You could absolutely have a variable that you think is going to predict variability in the slopes, but not the intercepts, or the intercepts, but not the slopes. But in this case, we're saying we think sector might explain variability in both the intercepts and the slopes. So here I can do the same thing if I want to know about what proportion of the variance in the randomly varying slopes is explained by sector. I can take the tau naught naught from the baseline model minus the tau naught naught for the model that has sector in it, divide, I said tau naught naught, I meant tau 1 1, divided by the tau 1 1 for the baseline model, right? And this is again going to give me sort of a rough estimate of the proportion of variance in the slopes that's explained by SES, by whatever my level 1 or level 2 variable, sorry. Explained by sector. Now I'm totally mixing it up. Proportion of variance in the slopes that's explained by my level 2 variable, which is sector here. This is the proportion of variance in the SES slopes that's explained by sector, my level 2 variable. And I might find, I mean, this is useful to look at too, because I might find, like, well, maybe I've got this level 2 variable. It doesn't explain any of the between cluster variance in the intercept, or it doesn't explain any of the between cluster variance in the slope. That would sort of tell us it's not a very good predict, right? And if this doesn't explain, let's say the tau 1 1 is basically the same. Let's say the tau 1 1 doesn't budge. It's basically the same before and after we put sector in the model. That would be telling me sector doesn't actually explain any of the between cluster variance in the slope. So sector's not a good predictor of SES slopes. So I could probably lose that for, I mean, right? I could probably model if I wanted. It's not doing anything for me. You know? Yes. Well, I mean, I think you want to be, I'm explaining in principle how all of this stuff works. I'm not giving you a roadmap right now for how to conduct your studies, right? I'm just explaining, like, if I did this, this is what this would be. We'll talk about some like best practices in model building as we go along. But right now I'm just pointing out that, like, you know, if I have a predictor here, a level 2 predictor, and it doesn't budge the between cluster variance, right, in the slope or the intercept, that's really telling you that predictor is not helping to explain any of that between cluster variance, so it's not a very good predictor, right? So that certainly is a fair evaluation. Would I expect sector, remember the variance in this, sigma squared, would I expect sector to be able to explain any of the within cluster variance, the within cluster residual variance? So would I expect sector to be able to explain some of my sigma squared? Yes, no, why not? What do you think? Yeah, exactly. Like, remember, that's exactly right. Remember that this is within cluster variance, right? So this is about how people are deviating from their cluster, right? From their cluster predicted value. This is all within cluster. Sector is a cluster level variable. So every kid in the same school has the same value on sector. So if you think about it from that perspective, like, if you've got a variable where every person has the same value within a school, there's no way it could possibly explain within school variance, right? Because within that school, it's a constant, not a variable. It is a variable, but it's a variable that only varies at the cluster level. So any variable that varies at the cluster level is not going to be able to explain within cluster variance, right? Now, the converse is not true. If you have a variable that's a level 1 variable like SES, we started to see that last week. A level 1 variable like SES, it could actually sort of operate on both levels, right? Why is that the case? Why do I say, like, a level 1 variable like SES could have both within and between cluster? I'm kind of giving it away there. It could have both within and between cluster variance. SES could, right? Schools don't just differ in terms of their math achievement. They also differ in terms of their clientele. Some schools are higher SES schools and some schools are lower SES schools. And the school SES does tend to relate to school math achievement. And so even though I put SES in as a level 1 predictor, like, it has the ability to be explaining both within school variance, because within a given school, kids of higher SES maybe tend to do better on math than kids of lower SES. But it's also true that schools of higher SES tend to do better in math, like in their mean math achievement, than schools of lower SES. And by just putting this in grand mean centered, uncentered or grand mean centered, I'm sort of allowing it to operate on both levels, right? That's going to bring us sort of to our centering conversation.
It's 10:25.
No.
So you know.
Okay.
We only have a couple more slides before.
Yeah, we should definitely get done with those.
Yeah. And before we break, once you're done, I have a couple of housekeeping.
Okay. So again, this is just sort of combining terms here, right? So we can make this into one combined model. I think we've kind of talked about this already, but I guess what I want to say is that the important thing to remember is that U sub naught J and U sub 1, like whatever our U's are, they're residuals, right? And so the residuals vary across schools. They're not independent within schools, right? Because every kid in a cluster is going to get when you sort of think about, like, if we were sort of predicting a kid's score, right? You could imagine every kid in the school is going to get the U sub naught J is going to be like attached to their predicted score, potentially. I mean, but it will be. I mean, there are sort of two ways to think about that, but let's think about it that way. And they're not independent within schools, right? So those level 2 residuals are common to every student within a school. They vary across schools. and these are residuals, right? It's the unexplained variance. So as we build models and we put in more predictors, we expect for the if we've got good predictors, we're going to expect for the unexplained variance to go down. Which again, is just the way it works in a multiple regression model as well, but we just are sort of operating at a bunch of different levels now. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Right, and so our variances, again, just to kind of reiterate that the variance that we've got is really residual variance, the variance that's remaining after accounting for the level 2 variance, right? So as we're adding predictors, these things are residuals, and they're always residuals, but that these are always the remaining variance after controlling for, after accounting for, or holding constant the level 2 variables in the model. And this is where I was saying, like I said this already, that reducing the variability in these residuals implies that those level 2 variables provide some explanation of the dependent variable. And so, ideally, we'd like to have a model that sort of that helps reduce that variance, right? Okay, let's do housekeeping things and then let's take a break.
Okay, so
Oh, wait, no, hold on. Last slide. Just like level 1, I think we already talked about this. The variance explained in the slope at level 2. So I'm using QQ there because it's like general for slope. So it could be Q11, Q22, Q33, whatever. The variance explained in the slope by the level 2 variables and it could be a set of level 2 variables. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the, tau from the simpler model, right? The slope variance for the simpler model. Could be the intercept variance too, but minus the slope variance for the fuller model, the more complex model, divided by the slope variance for the simpler model. And this is going to give me the proportion of variance that's explained by a level 2 variable or a set of level 2 variables. So it works exactly like the proportion variance explained at level 1 with the sigma squared, but now it's at level 2. Yeah. Yeah, so taus are always between cluster residual variance. So this would be the proportion of between cluster residual variance in slope Q that is explained by your variable or set of variables that you've put in the model. Sure. Well, we already talked about random and non-randomly varying. We're good. We're good. We talked about. No. We're good on random and non-randomly varying. So we'll stop there. And you've got housekeeping
yeah,
things?
just 2 quick things. So first, Monday in the office hours, people had a lot of questions about ggplot and share a cheat sheet. So I uploaded it into the R information section on Husky CT cheat sheet on using ggplot. And then the second thing is, so we were thinking about changing the Tuesday office hours from in-person to virtual because some people were requesting that. We had some issues with the poll or the survey on Husky CT. So if you feel very strongly that the Tuesday office hours needs to be in person, can you?
Yeah, no judgment. Who would prefer to have at least some office hours in person, I guess is the question. Anybody feel strongly about that? I feel like most people who've come up to us individually have expressed a strong preference the other way, which is to have more of them be remote, just because I think it increases flexibility for people who might not be here on campus or might be far away and have trouble getting here. So unless somebody has major issues, speak now. It's like a wedding. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Unless somebody has major issues, what we're going to do is we're going to change the office hours. Both Monday and Tuesday will be remote. Same times, but they'll be remote. And if you're a person for whom neither set of office hours works, please do send us an individual email and let us know that so that we can try to make sure to accommodate you as well in some fashion.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds like starting next week.
Good. Good.
Okay.
Excellent. All right. So let's take like a, what time is it? 31. Okay, let's come back at 40. 9-minute break. Got a lot to do. I do.
I was like, does she know?
Well, that's what I was saying. Showing the centering stuff in ours. It's a little more complicated. Yes. Hello.
I have a really vague question.
Okay, I'll try not to give a vague answer.
Question to Betsy.
A lot of the times when I'm doing code, I get like the error function LM, like data frame.
Like, what do you mean? It's just like a total, and does it give you anything or does it?
And it's like in random codes. I don't know if it's a package thing because I guess that's another question. When I
Are you using a Mac or a PC?
a Mac.
Oh, God.
And when I
No, not a Mac.
when I downloaded and installed packages, maybe that's my big.
Yeah.
Close the app.
Okay, that's a great question. No, you don't need to reinstall them, but you always need to recall them from the library. So like so there was that first set of install packages, you only have to do that once, but those library things, if you close down, you always have to re-say library. And so I always start like with all the packages I'm going to be using in, like, at least for this class, I always like put all the packages I'm going to be using in the session at the top. And then that's a good idea anyway, because if you run all of those and you, for some reason, don't have one of the ones you need installed, then it will prompt you and be like, oh, that one's not installed. And then, yeah, because I think that's probably exactly what's happening is that like you've closed down, you've reopened, you haven't said library, you're trying to run it. I do that sometimes. I mean, it's like, it's easy to forget that, like, yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Hi.
Chaitanya.
So nice to meet you.
Yeah, so I missed the last two classes. This is my first class. So is there anything that I have to cover for the last two regarding the last classes?
Well, so yeah, so there was a homework that is due tomorrow, actually, homework 1. Yeah. So
LFK missed it, like day before yesterday on 12th.
yeah. So there's a homework that's due tomorrow.
Okay.
And I can obviously give you an extension, but you should definitely, I think it's a really basic homework. It's just kind of getting on the board with R and multi-level modeling. So I would say try to do the homework and see, I mean, you were engineering, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we do have office hours. So I think, also there is a video. I try to, oh gosh. That reminds me, let me just pause this. Oh, I won't worry about it now. Oh, yeah, there we go. I can do it. Okay, here we go. So, oh, yeah. Okay. So now we're going to talk about centering. I will try to, I may skip a couple of the more esoteric slides that I put in here for now, and we can always come back to those later. But I think it's important to get the basics of group mean and grand mean centering down. Well, grand mean centering is easy, but yeah, right? Isn't that good? Centering, very meta. So here's our one slide review of what we do in regression. So in regression, everybody's thought about centering in regression, yes? If you thought about centering in regression, raise your hand. Okay, that's just about everybody. Good. So again, in regression, we often think about this idea. We need to center predictors so that 0 is a meaningful value for the intercept. To be fair, I would say people probably worry about intercepts a lot less in multiple regression than we do in multi-level modeling. Have you noticed that already? Like the intercept was kind of a throwaway parameter in multiple regression, right? Like, and here we're like all about the intercept. So it's kind of weird in that way. So, but if we want to interpret the intercept, if we want 0, I said, so 0 is a meaningful value. Well, so 0 is a meaningful value, and also so the intercept is a meaningful value, right? It really probably should say, so the intercept is a meaningful value when all of the predictors are 0. But 0 should be a meaningful value for the predictor too. So in regular regression, we probably don't worry about centering that much until we get to interactions, right? And then when we have interactions and centering, that's usually when people spend a lot of time thinking about centering in multiple regression, because we have to be able to interpret the interaction, right? And that becomes really important to sort of think about centering. Now here, obviously, we're going to have interactions out the wazoo, so obviously that's going to be an issue for us too. When we have a single level model, there's really, I mean, generally, one choice, which is what's called mean centering, where you subtract the mean from each score, right? So I take person I and school J's score, right? And I subtract the mean, like the mean score. And again, I guess I shouldn't really have IJ because I'm thinking about single level regression. So really person I's score minus the mean of all of the I's, right? Because in single level regression, I'm not thinking about the clusters. But okay, that's all we're going to say about single level regression. That's pretty easy. Now, it gets a little more complicated when we get into the multi-level world. And I just want to sort of start and talk about like some sort of basic general sort of things to think about. So first, the choice of centering or scaling, sometimes it's called scaling, the choice of centering or scaling your level 1 variables really depends on your specific needs for the analysis. So there are some general guidelines about best practices, etc. But the reality is that there is no one size fits all answer for how you should best center your variables. So I'm going to talk about, centering strategies, but I think it's important to remember that, depending on your analysis, your research questions, you really need to think about what centering strategy makes sense for you. And obviously, the most important thing is, regardless of how you center your variables, what's most important is that you interpret your parameters accordingly, because how you center your variables will have an impact on how your parameters are interpreted, right? So centering does transform your explanatory variables. And so it is going to actually impact the estimation of the parameters. And so it's going to impact the parameter estimates themselves, right? It can affect the estimates for the variances and covariances. It alters their interpretation. And so, that's all fine. It's just, again, we need to be really thoughtful about how we do this centering. And I would say, like I said, there's no one way to approach centering decisions, but you should really make these decisions early before you ever analyze your data. And you should make sure that, like, whatever decisions you're making, you're actually going to be able to interpret your parameters after you run your model, to keep from like sort of running model, making decisions that just don't kind of align with the goals for your analysis. So, pre-registration is a big thing right now, right? Open science principles. This is the kind of thing that you would definitely want to have in your pre-registration. Is these, not just these are my variables and I'm running multi-level models, but these are my variables, I'm running multi-level models. This is how I plan to center or code each of my variables at each of the levels. And then also, like, again, we haven't gotten to like how to think about model building strategies, but in there you would also want to talk about your model building strategies. How are you going to build those models? But it's really, really important to be thinking about centering right up front. I have definitely seen too many scenarios where people don't think about centering, they run models, and then they go to try to interpret their results and they don't know how to interpret their results, right? And then they come to me to ask how to interpret their results. And the first question that I always ask is, how are the variables centered? Because I can't possibly help you to interpret your results if I don't know. And then sometimes they don't even know. They're like, huh? What? I don't know. So super important. Okay. So we're going to start off by just thinking about random intercepts models. We're not even going to worry about random coefficients models right now because it's a little simpler to think about random intercepts models to start. So, we've got a random intercept model, but we do have a predictor in there. So we want to find out how well does SES predict math achievement. And remember, SES is this really interesting variable where we said, like, it has both within and between school components, right? So within schools, in a given school, do students of higher SES tend to have higher math achievement? That's like a within school kind of research question, right? So I want to know, like, just again, let's imagine a given school. Do kids in that school who have higher SES, do they tend to do better in math than kids of lower SES? And again, I'm saying for one school, but ideally we might want to think about that for all of our schools and like pool across schools and sort of within schools in general. Do kids of higher SES tend to do better in math, right? There's also a between school component to SES, which would be like, do schools of higher SES, do they also tend to have higher mean math achievement, right? Those are two actually different questions. I mean, again, not completely, you know, I mean, not, well, those are two very different questions, right? So, and I might think, well, yeah, I would expect that schools of higher SES schools probably do tend to have higher mean math achievement. But if you think about that, we've got like this within schools research question, and we've got this between schools research question, right? So I might want to really try to sort of separate out the within school effective SES on math achievement and the between school effective SES on math achievement. Does everybody kind of follow the logic there? Okay. So if I just estimate, again, this is just the level 1 model. I'm not showing the level 2 equations here, but just looking up at the level 1 model there, if I just estimate a level 1 model, right, where I have, you know, sort of a slope coefficient, right, for the effective SES on math achievement times the SES of a person, like that beta sub j, which again, I said I've got a random intercepts model, so I don't have a U term for that, right? So I'm just estimating one beta actually across all of the clusters in the sample, but so that's one issue. But the other issue is like, it's only one beta, right? So I've got this sort of what Kaufman calls a smooshed coefficient, right? Very technical term. You'll see it referred to as conflated effects in other writing on the topic. But like now my beta sub j is like a blend of the within school effective SES on math achievement and the between school effective SES on math achievement, right? And it's a blend of those two things. Even if so again, maybe I don't center SES, and now the intercept is when SES is 0, but the SES effect is still this uninterpretable blend of the two things. Or I could grand mean center SES, which we've talked about. Grand mean centering SES would just mean I take the overall average SES score across the entire sample and I subtract that from each person's individual SES score. But that doesn't solve this problem of having smooshed effects, right? Because I still, yes, I've centered it so that I can better interpret the intercept, but I still have this issue that I've kind of mooshed together like the within school effective SES on math achievement and the between school effective SES on math achievement, right? And so, you know, I say, is that wrong? Not if that's what you want. Actually, I would scratch that. I would say like, it's pretty much, don't do this, right? I mean, there are occasions in which you might want to grand mean center SES, but generally you don't want this. Generally, you don't want the smooshed coefficient. Like I'm hard pressed to think of a time when the smooshed coefficient is a good coefficient. And what's really interesting is you might think to yourself, well, okay, but like if let's just say I back out and I run a multiple regression and I ignore clustering and I get, you know, the effective SES on math achievement, right? So I get some sort of coefficient in a multiple regression. And let's just say I grand mean center here and I grand mean center in just an ordinary least squares regression. Would I get the same coefficient for B? Because you might think, well, like that B is also like an uninterpretable blend of the within school and the between school effect of SES on math achievement, right? So your inclination might be to think that's what I'm getting. What I'm getting here is going to look like the regression coefficient that I would get if I ran this as an ordinary least squares regression model. But you would be wrong. It's not. Yes. Well, why would you not? You'd always know what the grand mean is, wouldn't you? I mean, like you've got the data, right? Oh, I'm talking about like sample mean. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there are lots of ways to sort of think about rescaling variables, right? Centering is one of them, but you could standardize them all. That would be like another scaling method, or you could do other kinds of scaling techniques to put them. I mean, it's a different way of, I mean, there are lots of different ways to scale variables. Again, you need to interpret them based on the scaling method, but it's still going to have the same problem that we're talking about here. It's not, that will not solve any of the issues that we're talking about. So whether you grand means, like, actually, whether you grand mean center, whether you leave the variable uncentered, or whether you use some other technique that doesn't try to partition the variance into between and within, you're going to have the same problem that we're talking about here. Okay, so we've got this smushed coefficient. It's not actually going to be the same as the regular old regression coefficient you would get if you just ignored clustering. So it's, I think it'd be hard, so that makes it kind of a weird coefficient. All right, so what we can do is we can use centering techniques to actually partition the variance in a predictor into the within variance and the between variance. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to take our predictor variable and we're going to break our predictor variable into two pieces, right? So let's think about SES for a minute, because that's the variable we're going to use. So we're going to take SES, and we could imagine saying, I want to look at the within cluster, like how much does your SES vary from your cluster mean SES, right? So that's going to tell me about how much does your relative standing on SES in your school, how much does that actually influence your math achievement, right? And then I can say, okay, well, what about the cluster means of SES? How much do the cluster means of SES? How much do the school means vary from the overall mean? And that's going to give me an idea of how much the between school effect of SES on math achievement, right? So what we can do is we can take any of our predictors and we can basically sort of partition the variance in the predictor into the within school variance and the between school variance. And again, to do this, imagine I've got SES by J. Now, instead of taking the overall mean on SES, I want to take, like, I would say, or that's by J, hold on. In context. Sub ij. Let's just leave the sub ij off for now. This is getting to be a bit. SES sub ij centered within context is equal to SES sub ij, right? So that's like each person's SES score minus put a bar here. I don't always have bars in my slides because I was having trouble getting bars in my slides, but this SES sort of dot J means this is the school mean SES, okay? So I take person I and school J's SES, and I subtract out the school mean SES. And then what I have there is really the deviation of that person from their school's mean, right? And this is my new variable that is what we call group mean centered, or sometimes called CWC, centered within cluster. So this is my new variable. But notice that because I'm subtracting out the SES sub J, like I'm subtracting out from each person's mean, so from each person's SES, their own school's mean, I've lost all information about where that person is in terms of their relative standing across the entire sample, right? So what I know with this variable, I know how you compare to your cluster. Are you above your cluster? Are you below your cluster, right? But I don't have, so a score here of 0 means you're at the cluster mean. A positive score means you're scoring higher than the cluster mean, and a negative score means you're scoring lower than the cluster mean. But I've lost all information about your cluster like how your cluster differs from other clusters, right? But, so that's good, actually, in the sense that we were trying to partition the variance into within cluster and between cluster variance. And you can see how I've really partitioned the variance here in SES into the within cluster variance. But if I didn't do something with these school mean SES variables, then I've lost all of the information about how schools differ from each other in terms of their cluster means, and that would be problematic, right? So it's going to be really important. I mean, it's always, well, I would argue it's always really important to be thinking about these aggregates. But I mean, especially when we're cluster mean centering, because I've basically taken this variable and I've just broken it into two pieces. The within cluster piece, which is this, and now I've got again, you can imagine I've got an SES cluster mean for each cluster in my sample. So that can become like another variable, right? So now I took this SES variable and I basically am creating two new variables in my data file. One variable is how much this variable, this SES score for this person varies from their cluster mean. And the next one is just the cluster mean for their school. So every kid in the school is going to have the same score on SES.J, right? They're all going to have the same score. So what am I going to do though with this cluster mean? Well, I probably would want to center it, right? So that I can interpret the parameters in my model. So how am I going to deal with this? Well, the good news is that centering at level 2 is super easy. There's really not much to say about centering at level 2. We're going to grand mean center at level 2. So we're going to take SES.J, right? So we've got sort of like the mean SES for each school, each of our J schools. So imagine I've got 180 scores here, right? And then I'm going to subtract out the overall SES, right? I'm going to say dot dot. So this is now just the overall sample mean, right? So the overall mean SES. Or the mean of, the mean of school means or the overall mean. Okay, and so then I've got how much does the school mean SES take from the overall SES? And again, a positive score would mean this school's SES is above the overall mean in the sample. A negative score would mean this school's SES is below the mean, right? And a 0 would mean this school is right at the overall mean in terms of their SES. But again, there won't be any within school variability on this. We're going to have 160 scores here for the 160 clusters. Yes, question. Oh, no, well, maybe we should go to the next slide. That's good, because it's probably less sloppy. Okay. Right, this grand mean centering is the smushed, right? So like either this, I guess I should have put X on J here, right? So either like I don't do anything, or I grand mean center, but again, it's gonna give me something smushed. This is gonna give me something smushed. And this is going to give me it's going to give me this within cluster thing. But this in and of itself isn't enough, because I've now, if I do this root mean centering without thinking about the aggregate and adding the aggregate back in, then I'm only going to be able to model how within school changes in SES affect math achievement. But we've said that SES actually has both within school and between school components, right? So now, I mean, there could be a case, again, like there could be a case where you have a variable where there's literally only within cluster variability, in which case you wouldn't really need to add the aggregate back in at level 2. Can anybody think of an example where it's only within? Grades in high school. Oh, yeah, maybe, right? So maybe all the schools in the sample are high schools, and you've got sort of grade in school, and maybe there is only within cluster variability. Yeah, I was gonna say, you could imagine if you had like a study, let's say you're doing a multi-site trial and you randomly assigned 50% of the people to be in the treatment group and 50% of the people to be in the control group, and that assignment happens within cluster. So you always have an equal proportion. So you have to have an equal proportion of people in treatment and control across all of the clusters. But in that case, you would all be within, right? I mean, there are some but again, there could be cross-level interaction. So maybe that's not the best example, but generally speaking, like generally speaking, you're going to have both within and between cluster variants for most of your variables. Okay. So actually, not that still might it works. I can still do the cross-level interaction. Go ahead.
Is there a name or an improvement for the second one for the SES or what WC is for the first one? Is there a name for the?
Not really. We're going to take the cluster means and we're going to grand mean center them.
Okay.
So it's like the second thing is like, okay, we've got these cluster means now, right? We've got these things because they're subtracted out, we've lost them, right? So now I've got them. I need to reintroduce them into the model. And then generally speaking, like I said, thinking about centering at level 2 is really easy. It's kind of the same thought process that you would use for single level regression. So I'm just going to grand mean center them generally speaking. That's going to be the easiest thing to do. Yeah, so it's going to be x dot j. If I center, it's going to be x dot j, right, minus x dot dot. That's exactly right. Okay, so continuing along. Everybody so far so good? Good. Okay, so again, so why not just use SES grand mean centered? Like I said, it's really, one way to think about it, let me just call this to your attention is, here's my combined model. One way to think about it is if I use SES grand mean centered, one thing that I'm implicitly doing, which I might not be thinking about, but here it is. Here's my gamma 1 naught, right, is the effect of SES on math achievement. But I only have one gamma, 1 naught, right? There aren't two gammas. So what does that really mean? It means that I'm saying that whatever the within school effect of SES on math achievement is, it has to be equal to the between school effect of SES on math achievement, right? Because I only have gamma 1 naught, which is this effect of SES on math achievement. I have to be, because I don't have two different coefficients, I am saying the within school effect is the same as the between school effect. So remember how I know, like that doesn't seem right? But remember how I posed those research questions. What's the within school effect of SES on math achievement? How well does, right? Like how much does your relative standing within your school predict your math achievement? And then there's the, how much does school mean math achievement predict, or sorry, not math achievement. How well does school mean SES predict mean math achievement? Those are different potentially. But in this model, because I only have one gamma, I only have one effective SES on math achievement, I'm really saying they're the same. Whatever is the effect, within school effect of SES on math achievement, that coefficient is equal to the between school effect of SES on math achievement. And if you don't like that, then that gives you a compelling reason not to grand mean center. That's why you should group mean center and get sort of these different specific parts. Now, that could be true, by the way. It could absolutely be true that the within school effect is equal to the between school effect. But of course, if you only estimate one parameter, you have no way of testing whether it's true, right? But if I estimate a within school effect and a between school effect, then I could actually look at those two and say, are they equal? If they're equal, great. By the way, there's a name for this. Anybody here in sociology? Do we have any sociologists in the room? Good. Then okay. Tell me if I butcher anything. But in sociology, they often talk about contextual effects. So the idea is that, maybe there is an effect of your context over and above the sort of individual effect. Right? Sometimes these are called compositional effects. Sometimes they're called contextual effects. So in that kind of parlance, if there's no contextual effect, that would mean that the variable operates the same way, right? That the slope is going to be of equal magnitude in the within and the between equations. So that would be no contextual effect. And this model is assuming that there's no contextual effect. But if we break into these two pieces, if we sort of break our variable into two pieces, and I'm going to talk about two different ways we can break our variable into two pieces, then we can actually estimate the contextual effect and figure out if the contextual effect is 0 or not. And again, if the contextual effect is 0, that means that the within slope and the between slope are the same. And in that case, if that's the case, then we're fine doing this, right? But we won't know if it's the case unless we actually kind of investigate. So it's dangerous to assume this a priori. 0. If the contextual effect is 0, which means if the contextual effect is 0, it means that the within slope and the between slope are equal to each other. It means that the effect is equal across the two levels. And I will get into more details about that in just a second. Oh, yeah. I said that the intraclass correlation coefficient for math achievement is about 0.2. But here, actually, the important thing to think about would be the intraclass correlation coefficient for what? Not for math achievement, for SES, exactly. So like this is actually a case for why we might want to run an unconditional model for our predictor, because that's actually probably the best example I could have given for when I would not need to, do this group mean centering and adding the aggregate back in, which would be like, what if there is no between school variance in your variable, right? Which I think grade level was kind of a potentially good example of that, right? So like, what if, if there's no between school variance in your independent variable, then, well, I mean, I don't know. You probably still would want a group. I mean, that's kind of weird too, actually, because if there's no between school variance, you probably would actually want to separate out the coefficients to show that the between school coefficient is 0. But yeah. Okay. So going back to your question. Well, when we partition the variance into within and between school variance, we don't really know what factors contribute to that, explaining that variance. We're just sort of saying, oh, okay, there's a lot of variability in socioeconomic status. About 80% of the variability is within schools, let's say, and in fact, in this example that we use SES with this HSB, and I believe it's about 26.5%. So let's say 27% of the variance in SES is actually between schools, and about 73.5% is within schools. So there's actually more clustering within schools by SES than there is by math achievement, which if you stop and think about it, actually makes a lot of sense, right? So there's a lot of, it should not be the case, right? But there's a lot of segregation, school segregation by SES. And the greater the degree of segregation by SES, the higher that ICC for SES, for the SES variable is going to be, right? So if you got an ICC of 0 for SES, that would say all of the variability in SES is within schools. So like each school is a little like microcosm of sort of the overall, right? Like in terms of the variability in SES, there's lots of variability within schools. There isn't really any variability between schools. So it's not like some schools have higher mean SES than other schools. It's not going to happen, by the way, but that's what it would mean if it did happen. Okay, so I think I can convince you not to use grand mean centering, maybe. Just use not just use grand mean centering all by itself. Okay, so I said that the OLS coefficient of math, right, sort of regressed on SES is, and this is like an enrichment slide. You're not going to need to do anything this slide for your homework, I promise. But the total regression coefficient that you get for like if you were just doing an OLS regression is actually, it's actually the ratio of between school variance on SES. So again, taking the ICC, I could figure out what's the ICC. Then I could take what's the ratio of between school variance to within school variance, right? And I could, I can compute that number, multiply that by, if I got a between school, let's say I broke into two pieces and I got a between school regression coefficient and a within school regression coefficient. If I take the ratio of between school to within school variance times the between regression coefficient plus 1 minus that ratio times the within school variant, within school SES slope, then that would actually give me the total like OLS regression slope. So I could get that B sub T. So if I wanted, so I could actually take, if I do this multi-level modeling and I get a between regression slope and I get a within regression slope, I could use this formula to create what I would get from OLS regression. I could get my total regression slope. So it's basically just the total regression slope is just a weighting of the between and within regression slopes. Okay, but that smooshed effect that I was talking about is not that. It's not that. The smooshed effect is actually, again, enrichment. You're not going to have to do anything with this slide for your homework either, I promise. But this smooshed effect is actually basically the weighted average of the within and the between effects. And the weights here are actually like the variance in the estimate of your within effect and the variance in the estimate of your between effect. So we basically take 1 over those variances, which gives us an estimate of precision. And so we take that weighting and that will give you the smooshed effect. And trust me, I won't drag you through the algebra, but trust me when I say this is not the same as the total B that we got from the OLS regression model. And actually, when we look in R and we run some of these models, you're going to see that it's not the same as the total regression. So this smooshed effect, I would argue is, I mean, so that's what it is. But in my mind, that's even harder to interpret than the total effect. Like, I don't know. I don't want to interpret that. Okay. So again, we talked about group mean centering. It's called centering within context, group mean centering. Hoffman refers to this as variable centering because you actually have a the mean that you're using for it varies across schools, right? There isn't one fixed thing that you're using to center everybody. And again, when I do this, then my level 1 slope is telling me about the level 1 relationship net any group membership effects. So it tells me nothing about what's going on, nothing about the between school stuff, because I've subtracted out those school means. So, you know, it's really just telling me about within schools, what's the effect of SES on math achievement, right? And so, you know, you could imagine though, that like, you know, again, a lot of times there's a lot of research actually that goes on in terms of like, this is called the frog pond or the big fish, little pond effect. You could imagine for like the same frog or fish or person really, but I don't know. We like these analogies with water creatures. The effect of being in a pond with big frogs might be different from the effect of being in a pond with small frogs, right? So like, again, that's like your relative standing within your pond, right? I could be the same size fish, but like if I'm in a pond with a bunch of big fish, then I look like the small fish. And if I'm in a pond with a bunch of small fish, then I look like the big fish. So when we think about this group mean centering, we're really getting this idea of like, what's your relative standing, like as compared to everybody else in your, you know, sort of in your cluster. But again, I lose any information about, like, I know you're the small fish in your pond, but I don't actually know overall if you're a big fish or not, right? And that's, again, why I'm going to need to bring those cluster means back in. All right. All right, so here's a picture where I've got the random, for simplicity, I'm going to show a random intercepts model because it's a lot messier when model. But here, like the dots here are the cluster means. So I've got these little, right, same slopes for everybody, you got random intercepts. Notice that the intercepts vary. If I were to grand mean center, that's really what that red line is. I'd be taking every person's dot and I'd be subtracting from it the overall mean, which would be like the red line. That would be like grand mean centering, right? But those blue dots are the cluster means for each of the clusters, okay? And so when I do this group mean centering, I'm subtracting each person's score. That's really is X, I, J. Again, you can, because I'm just subtracting out your own cluster mean, I've lost information that tells you about how this person relates to the overall mean. Right? I only know from here how they relate to it. And if I take these cluster means, all of these cluster means, right, and then I center around the grand mean, then I've really partitioned into these two pieces. How much does the SES of your cluster deviate from the overall? How much does your SES clusters is? That make sense? Cool. Yeah. Well, the standardization gets complicated too because we've got, like, remember, standardizing is always based on like standard deviations, which are square roots of variances, and then what variance? We've got between cluster variance, we've got within cluster variance. So that's another wrinkle with standardization that gets a little bit complicated, right? Right, exactly. You can take the unstandardized estimates and then you can make sense of them. You can scale them. You can sort of standardize them after the fact based on what makes sense to you, right? But if you think about it, really any between cluster sort of variables should be really a function of between cluster variance, and within cluster variables should be a function of within cluster variance, but those are really different variances. And so when you standardize, they're like maybe deceptively look like they're on the same scale, but they're not. So it just gets, standardization gets a little bit more complicated. That's why it's not sort of a default. Okay. Right. So I think I said all of this. So again, we can get that frog pond effect just from the group mean centering, but we do need to consider how the aggregate of our variable is related to the outcome, right? Even after either after controlling for the effect of individual SES or not. If we control for the individual effect of SES, so we look at how the aggregate of SES relates to math achievement after controlling for the effect of individual SES, that's actually what the contextual effect is. The contextual effect is basically the difference between the group effect and the individual effect. So if we find that a contextual effect is 0, it really means that the coefficient is the same. It's operating in the same way within and between clusters. So it means that the within cluster slope is the same as the between cluster slope. Okay? So I can get, so there are a couple of different ways I can get an estimate of that contextual. Skip that. Right? I guess I want to say, again, that if we look at this, right, in group mean centering here, this beta sub 1j, we come down here to gamma 1 naught. The gamma 1 naught is the pooled within group effect of SES on math achievement, right? What's the mean SES? What's the gamma sub naught j? Well, talk about that in a minute. Okay, here we go. Oh, we'll talk about it now. So gamma. That's why I don't usually put animations in my slides. Occasionally I do because I think it's clever, but then I always forget I do it. Okay, so gamma 1 naught, this is, or gamma not 1, sorry, gamma not 1, the red one there, is the between group effective SES on math achievement, right? This guy, the between group effective SES. So contextual, then gamma not 1 should be equal to gamma 1, right? Again, this assumes that I've group mean centered. So I should say that. Assuming I've group mean centered, so I've partitioned SES into the within piece and the between piece, right? And then I add the aggregate back in at level 2. Then if gamma naught 1 is equal to gamma 1 naught, that means there is no contextual effect. Because the cluster, when you cluster mean center, basically the gamma 1 naught, gamma naught 1 minus the gamma naught 1, again, assuming you've cluster mean centered, that is the contextual effect. With me? So we can do this. We can fit this model, and then we can actually ask ourselves, are these two coefficients, are they the same? Right? If yes, then actually I could grand mean center and not worry about adding the aggregate back in at level 2. That's like the one scenario in which grand mean centering is fine. And grand mean centering, again, implicit without adding an aggregate back in, implicitly assumes that those are the same because I'm only getting one coefficient. And if they're not the same, that one coefficient I get is that smooshed, really weird combination of the two. And I showed you a formula how that smushing goes on, but you don't have to worry about recreating the smushing, I promise. All right. Oh, one more point. So, cool little thing. If I cluster mean center, the SES variable, and then I take the cluster means, if I look at the correlation between the cluster mean centered variable and the cluster means of that variable, what do you think the correlation is going to be? 0. Yeah, always good guesses, right? It's going to be 1 or 0. I know it's going to be one of those too. If it's not 1, it's going to be 0. But yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's 0.575. Come on, man. No, it's 0. It's 0, right? Because think about it. I've literally broken this variable into 2 orthogonal pieces. And I'll show you, maybe if we ever get there, in R, I'll show you. I run the correlation in our R markdown, and I show you the correlation between these two pieces is literally 0. So that's kind of cool too. No collinearity between the within and the within. Yeah. These definitions go with under group mean centering. So that's right. So this gamma 1 naught is the pooled within group effective SES on math achievement. And the gamma naught 1, and again, it also assumes there's nothing else in the model because I'm not saying after control, right?
So they're like masters of disguise.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's one of the questions on the homework is like, okay, run it a couple different ways. Now tell me what the heck gamma naught 1 and gamma 1 naught are in this scenario versus in this scenario. So gamma naught 1 here again is the between group effect. Okay, so again, in terms of this contextual effect, I've got the within group and the between group coefficients. If I want to know if there's a differential effect, this is exactly what I was saying. This contextual or compositional effect is just gamma, I already said this, gamma naught 1 minus gamma 1 naught. Okay, I want to get to the grand mean centering, and then after we talk for a minute about grand mean centering, then we're going to turn to R. Okay, so under grand mean centering, again, really easy. We subtract the overall mean from each person's value on the independent variable. So now the intercepts, this is important. The intercepts really mean something different here. If I've group mean centered, the intercepts are, again, think about the value when everything in the model is 0. If I've group mean centered, then it's really like when each group is at its group mean, right? So it really is kind of still like an overall, it's like a mean of school means in that case. When you group mean center, the intercept becomes like a mean of school means. But in grand mean centering, that's not true because I'm actually controlling for SES, right? And so the intercepts are adjusted group means, just like you would have in an ANCOVA model. And so the variance in the intercept is now like the between group variance in the adjusted means, holding the level 1 predictors constant at their overall means, right? So the effects of the level 1 variables are partialed out of the between group variance when you grand mean center. So that means the level 2 coefficients represent the group level relationship between the level 2 predictor and the outcome variable, or the randomly varying intercepts technically, right? But it's the group level relationship between the level 2 variable and the group mean, or that's really the intercepts. But again, these math achievement at the school level less the influence of the level 1 predictor. So after controlling for, or after adjusting for, or holding constant at the mean, those level 1 predictors. So is everybody with me? So big difference is in group mean centering, I'm not controlling, right? I'm not really controlling for the, not controlling for what's going on, right, between groups, but with, or not between, right, maybe that's true if I don't put that group mean back in. But here, I'm really saying, like, now my gamma not 1 is going to be the between group effective SES on math achievement after controlling for individual SES, right? And my intercept is going to be holding SES constant at the overall mean. So now if I want to get those contextual effects, right, I said it was the between slope minus the within slope for centering within context. But if I take a grand mean centered SES variable and I add the aggregate back into the grand mean centered variable, then the contextual effect is actually just going to be the between slope, because it is after accounting for the level 1 variable, like the level 1 SES effect. So what that means actually is that, again, I'm going to want to put the mean variable in at level 2 here if I want to get contextual effects. So I could grand mean center the variable, put the mean back in, and now I have a slide here. So centering again, notice the top. Centering at the grand mean looks like the same model, but I've just centered at the grand mean instead. Now, notice that what I'm saying is gamma sub 1 naught is the individual level of SES on math achievement, with mean SES partialed out, and gamma sub naught 1 is the group level effect of SES on math achievement, controlling for individual level effects or holding individual SES constant. And what that means here, that this gamma sub 1 naught, it is literally the contextual effect. It's basically the difference between the individual, it's the difference between the within effective SES and the between effective SES. So it takes on a really different meaning here. Again, got to add the aggregate back in at level 2. Right? Now, when we add the aggregate back in at level 2, we should get, again, this is all for random intercept models right now. We should get similar estimates of the intercept variance. And so tau naught in a random intercepts model is going to have a similar interpretation. Things get a little bit more complicated when we get to the random coefficients models. But it's much easier to, I think, start by thinking about the random intercepts model. So again, what is this gamma naught 1 in grand mean centering? It's really, you can think of it as like the difference between two hypothetical students who have the same SES. So like I've held SES constant at the individual level. Gamma naught 1 is telling me like what's the school effect of mean SES sort of holding individual SES constant. So like the thought experiment is, imagine like you've got, students have the same mean SES, but they attend schools that differ by 1 unit on SES. How would that affect their math achievement? And that is the contextual effect. In group mean centering, gamma naught 1 is the difference between the means of two schools that differ by 1 unit on mean SES. So it's really like the between group effect of SES on math achievement. And to get the contextual effect, if you've group mean centered, you're going to have to take the gamma naught 1 minus gamma 1 naught. Okay, now's a good time to do R, right? I think I've done enough for them to do the homework, have I? Yeah, so this just says the same thing.
Comparing models.
Comparing models, we'll get. So, talk about that right now. And I definitely won't talk about interactions, but if you want to know more about interactions, you should see that. Oh, last thing. So again, whether you group or grand mean center, you should add the aggregates back in at level 2. Like if you take nothing else away from this lecture, remember that. And then you should take other things away from that lecture though. And then again, there are other things we could think about. We can actually group mean center or grand mean center for that matter. We can center categorical variables. For a long time, people would be like, yeah, but don't center your categorical variables. There's really nothing wrong with centering your categorical variables. And there's a great paper that's in press right now at Psych Methods that talks about group mean centering categorical variables and adding the group means back in at level 2. So you could take a look at that paper. There's a great paper from a couple of years ago that talks about latent variable centering of predictors, which is super cool. And you can do an M+, but because we're not using M+ in here, we're not going to do it. But if you're interested in that, you should see that paper. And then in terms of finding more information on centering, you can see these are some of the great, like Ron Bush and Breich, it's a classic. Those are great pages if you have that book. There are a lot of great centering articles that have come out in the last few years. So these are ones that I would particularly recommend. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And we're going to turn to R.
Hand out the printouts of our markdown.
Okay, I don't want to save that. Okay, so now, ta-da. Okay.
Something else is something in the middle.
Ha! Oops. Oh well, too bad for them.
There's hold on, but there's a lot of it.
Okay,
Oh.
so you should on the. Let me just make sure I'm getting this from the. I think oh no, that is from the course. Hold on. Okay, so go to the courses folder if you're using the desktop, or go to Husky CT if you're using your laptop, and go ahead and download. It's actually the same data, but there's a new markdown file, so you can put the new markdown file in the folder that you used last week. And the markdown file is called Multilevel Modeling, Centering, September 14th, Markdown.
Oh, you have.
Okay. So you should all be opening up the markdown file. Remember, a couple of reminders. Make sure to put this markdown file in the same, make a folder and make sure you have the hsb.csv file, the data file, and this markdown file in the same folder on your computer. Before you open it. Download it, put it in the folder, and then try to open the markdown file. Because I have not I have not created like the path to go find the data, right? Because this way it is very general and it works for all of you, because you would all have different paths. So that is a way of getting around that. But the only way that it works is if you put the markdown file and the data file in the same folder together. And download them first. Don't try to run this from Husky CT, because I think that was one of the problems people were having last week, right?
Right, they opened it through Husky CT, but then they put it in the folder.
Yeah, don't open it in Husky CT. Just
From the folder.
Yeah, download the two files into a folder. Don't open them. Once they're in the folder, open the markdown file, and you should be all set. But if you do it and do something else besides that, you will have problems. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is, and you have all of this printout, but the first thing I'm going to do, I think I've got all the stuff in this library statement that I need. I've got, let's see. Oh, okay, sorry. I think those in the top actually were the ones I thought I didn't need. Okay. So if you have not, okay, we don't have to worry about this. We're not going to get to that today. We'll skip the whole Randy Garcia thing. we're doing that. No, we're not doing that today. So skip all those things that are commented out. Run, these are actually the things that you need. These are the library things. If yours croaks on Dadic MLM, because that's fine. You could actually just comment this guy out, because that's the thing that you dev tools to install, but we're not going to get to that. Don't worry about that. You should be able to run the rest of this. You should have installed all these packages last week, so that should be good. Now, we're going to read in our data file, and again, when we read in our data file, I'm going to actually, I don't know why I don't call that librarian earlier, but whatever. We're going to read in our data file. It's the same data file that we read in last week. So this code is exactly the same.
Make sure you read data file use. Try to open.
Yeah, make sure you read in the. Okay, so once you've got that read in, right, it should show you, because I put view HSP, so it should show you that your data are there. I always find that to be somewhat comforting. I like to see my data. I'm old school like that.
Time I run hers, it pops up.
And then, remember I talked about this last week, that the first thing I'm going to want to make sure I do is to make sure that my cluster ID variable is a factor variable. Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'm making sector a factor variable too, which is, again, doesn't really matter for today, but the most important thing is that school ID is a factor variable. And then I'm going to rerun our unconditional model, model 1, just so we have it for comparison purposes in case we want it. But I'm not really going to say anything about that right now. But so I'm just going to rerun model 1. That's the unconditional model that could give me the ICC and all that kind of stuff. Oops. Okay. It's my summary of model 1. Again, we saw that last week, so I have nothing to say about that now, but I just rerun it for. So now I'm going to center my level 1 predictor, and I'm going to center my level 1 predictor 2 different ways. I'm going to grand mean center it, and I'm going to group mean center it, and then of course I'm going to grand mean center the aggregate of that as well. But first, we're just going to run a model where we don't have the aggregate added back in, just quickly to kind of see what that looks like, and then we'll add the aggregate back in. So first thing is, and again, we're going to do this, we're going to start with a random intercepts model, because you'll see some nice things when we do that. Okay, so we grand mean center SES. We actually did this last week. So remember, I just am saying SES centered is basically the score on SES minus the overall mean on SES. So I need to run that. And then once I've run that, I can run the model. Then I can run this model, model 2A, which I'm saying, okay, model 2A. So remember here, A's are going to be grand mean centered and B's are going to be group mean centered. That's kind of how so 2A and 2B are going to be grand and group mean centered without the aggregate back in. 3A and 3B are going to be grand and group mean centered where we add the aggregate back in, just so we can kind of compare these. So in model 2A, I'm saying, right, I've got this mixed model, math achievement's my outcome variable. It's SES grand mean centered, so that's SES underscore C. Here you can see it's a randomly varying intercept, but I don't have a randomly varying slope, right? That's what this means. And the data are HSB. And if I run that, I can get a sort of a summary of what that model looks like. Okay, so let's just kind of keep track of the, I'm going to keep track of some of these. So our slope here, which is our gamma 1 naught. Oh yeah, there are a lot. Yeah, right on the board.
Eraser.
Here are more pens. Here are erasers. So our gamma 1 naught is 2.39 here. Sure, absolutely. What did I do? Oh yeah, sorry. Right up. That, see that? I've got, so that this is telling it what's randomly varying. This part in parentheses after the plus is always the random effects part of the model. So the first part of the model is always the fixed effects part, And the second part's the random effects part. And because I'm not allowing any of my slopes to randomly vary, I'm just going to say 1 bar school ID. And remember I said 1 just means the intercept. So if I don't have to say that 1 once I've got random slopes, but because I don't have any random slopes here, I'm just going to say 1 bar school ID, and that means I have a randomly varying intercept. Sure. So 2.39, that is my gamma 1 naught for the grand mean centered. Yeah, for the grand mean centered. And my intercept for the grand mean centered is 12.6. We're going to round to 2 places. 12.66. Okay, is my intercept. Right? And then I think a really interesting thing to look at is the tau naught naught here. So my tau naught naught is 4.77. Everybody see that? So that's the between school variance in math achievement after controlling for SES, right? So it's the between school variance in the intercepts. But because math achievement is grand mean centered, it really is the between school variance in math achievement holding SES constant at the overall mean. Gamma naught naught is the overall, like this is the intercept, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh, gee,
That's gamma.
it's a gamma.
Sorry, because I can't draw all the letters.
Yeah, that's your
Just to be clear. Grand mean centered means like this is here showing that that's what these are.
Okay, so now we need to group, now we're going to compare that to our group mean centered model. So here, the first thing we need to do is actually group mean center our variable. So how are we going to do that? Well, you're going to take if you don't know R, take my code and use it. But here it is. So basically, I'm grouping by school ID. You see that in line 2, right? So I'm grouping by school ID. This mutate is again going to create this new variable that's going to be school mean SES. I'm naming it. So I could name it anything there, but I'm calling it school mean underscore SES is equal to mean SES. And then SES centered within context is SES minus school mean SES. So this school mean, that might not have been clear. But because I grouped by school ID, when I say school SES, it's mean SES grouped by school ID. That's why if I didn't have this group by school ID and I said this, I would just get the overall, like sample mean on S. Grouping by school ID and then telling it I want to get the mean, computing the mean for your school. Follow what I mean? And then once I know, once I've done that, so really this part is actually giving me the cluster mean that I need, that I'm going to use later, right? And then here I've got SES, I'm going to call it SES CWC, which means context. It's really confusing because like GMC could be group mean or grand mean.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call it CWC, grand mean, and CWC is centered within context. Okay. So SES CWC is just going to be the SES variable minus school mean, the group cluster mean. Right? So this is actually creating 2 different variables for me, the cluster mean on SES and the each person's deviation from their cluster mean on SES. And that's what SES CWC is. Does that make sense to everybody? And again, if you don't feel totally proficient in R, just take this code and adjust it to suit your needs. Okay. So, but I need to run this. So I'll run it. And now, as I said, what's the correlation between school mean SES and group mean centered SES? So if I run that, okay, it looks like it's a number, but if you notice it's scientific notation. So the correlation between school mean SES and group mean centered SES is like negative 3.07 times 10 to the 18th, right? Like 10 to the negative 18th power. So like put a whole slew of zeros before that and you basically get a 0, right? I mean, I wish it would, I should set it to round. So But anyway, so basically that's 0, which makes sense. What's the correlation between school mean SES and grand mean centered SES? What do you think? There it is. School mean SES and grand mean centered SES. Is that going to be 0? No, right? Because again, grand mean centered SES has both the within and the between component in there. Right? So it's not going to be 0. It's interesting. What is it? Well, actually, the correlation between school mean SES and grand mean centered SES is 0.53. So those are definitely not orthogonal to each other, right? And if I wanted to correlate grand mean centered SES, mean SES, and group mean centered SES, do this. And if you look at this, this is kind of interesting. Again, you can see the correlation between school mean SES and group mean centered SES is exactly, well, again, it's not exactly 0, but it's basically 0, right? And then we see that 0.53 is the correlation between grand mean centered SES and school mean SES. And then I think this is kind of interesting too. Like, what's the correlation between SES centered within context and SES grand mean centered? Well, again, there's way more within school variability than there is between school variability. So when you look at the correlation there, they're actually quite highly correlated. They're correlated at a 0.85. Okay. So, if I wanted to know, I might want to know, because I want to know what proportion of the variance in SES, not math achievement, but SES, my predictor, what proportion of the variance in SES lies between schools? Because again, if there's no, between school variance in SES, well, that would be interesting. And know that. You can see if I run that model, so this is just an unconditional model with SES, and I notice I named it something different so I could keep track of that. You can see that the school variance is 0.16. The between school variance is 0.16. The within school variance is about 0.45. No, you don't need to write this. And then the ICC, here we go, is 0.26. So I was saying, again, this is SES. How much variance in SES is between schools? I just want to know, like, is there between school variance in my independent variable? Remember, I said that's one of the first things I might want to check. So I'm checking that. And there is between school variance in SES, right? And I can figure out the ICC for SES. And it's actually, and actually ICC might not work for some of you if you have not installed the Datic MLM package or run my little ICC code, but don't worry about that right now. Just run the Datic MLM code when you get home and it will work just fine. Or you can compute it by hand, or you can take the ICC code that I gave you last week. That all works fine. But just in case, right now I don't think I put in the function for the ICC here. So you do need to, actually, maybe you don't. Might be a function in the Elmer too, actually. Anyway, all right, so now model 2B. This is exciting. Now we've got our group mean centered model. Here we go. Now you're going to write. Okay, so notice here I'm taking SES CWC. I've got a random intercepts model, right? And here comes my information, my summary. So now my SES slope is 2.19. So notice that's not the same, 2.19 versus 2.39. It's definitely not the same slope, but again, it doesn't mean the same thing either, because this is really the pooled within cluster effective SES on math achievement. So this is really just like, within schools, what's the effect of SES on math achievement? And remember, I talked about the grand mean centered one without the mean added back in is that smooshed effect, right? It's kind of a little harder to interpret. Now my variance is 8.672 is the tau not 8.672. Why is it so much bigger than the tau not in the other model? Way bigger. Almost twice as big. Why? Well, what was I doing in the other model that I'm not doing here? In the other model, that was really the residual variance in the intercepts after, or like, right, the residual variance in the randomly varying intercepts after controlling for SES, because it was grand mean centered. And SES can explain some of the between group variance in math achievement, right? We saw that about 26% of the variance in SES is between schools. So SES, because it's grand mean centered, is getting to take a crack at explaining between school variance in math achievement, between school variance in the intercepts. And because it's getting to take a crack at explaining between school variance in the intercepts, and because it actually does a pretty good job of explaining between school variance in the intercepts, that's why the tau naught here is so much smaller. Here, with the group mean centered, that tau naught should be fairly similar. It's not necessarily going to be identical, but it should be approximately equal to the tau naught from model 1, the totally unconditional model, because I group mean centered SES, it can't explain between cluster variance in math achievement. Now, again, we're using maximum likelihood estimation, so you might not get like the exact identical number, but conceptually, it's basically should be the same as, and it should be approximately equal to the unconditional tau naught. But that's not true for grand mean centering. Everybody with me? Okay, cool. All right, so now I can actually use that compare thing. Oh, was there something else I was supposed to tell you? Gamma naught. Oh yeah, gamma naught is 12.64. So it's like not too different, right? Pretty similar. Okay, so I can compare models 2A and B. And this is where this compare thing really comes in handy, although with the caveat that it's giving you standard deviations instead of variances. Here we go. This is kind of nice because now I can actually, now I don't have to make Pam write the stuff, right? Because there it is. You can see that. Now notice that it's putting the SESC and SESCWC on different lines because they are different variables, right? But those are really sort of, we want to compare those parameters to each other. And you can see that actually, I don't know, you can see that you get different variances, right? Okay, I want to get to the next model. There's 2 models. I'm afraid to ask, what time is it? I have 3 minutes, great, no problem, no problem. Okay, so skipping to model 3B, we just have 2 more models. It will be fine. Okay, so model 3B, notice this. Oh, 3A, 3B, here's 3B. Group mean centered 3B, we'll do 3B first. Group mean centered SES, but mean SES is added back in now, okay? At level 2. So how do I do that? You can see here I've got SES, right? I've got school mean SES. I still have randomly intercepts, right? And I run that. So really, this is the important thing. I'm adding the cluster means back in. Now, technically, I have not actually centered the cluster means, which is fine in this particular scenario because they are actually already, they have a mean of 0. But like, again, in general, you want to make cluster means. Okay, and here we go. So now what do I get? This is actually, you know what? Let me run 3A because then I can do compare. We can look at them all at once. Okay, so let's run 3A. And then once 3A runs, come down to the code that says compare model 2A, 2B, 3A, and 3B, because this is really probably the most important table that we're going to spend 1 minute on. Run.
I probably don't need to write all these.
Yeah, you don't need to write all.
your
You don't need to write all these because these are going to come up. Dum da dum. Why is it taking so long? There we go. Okay, so I love this compare thing, by the way. Okay, so take a look at this quickly. So again, our intercepts are not really so different, really. Again, slightly different. That's not really where the action is. What's interesting here is notice the grand mean centered SES, when I didn't put the cluster mean back in, I got that smooshed effect. That's 2.39. But notice, if I group mean center, this really is Like, again, it's the pooled within cluster effect of SES on math achievement. And I get the same thing whether I grand mean center and put the cluster means back in, or group mean center and put the cluster means back in. Again, they're going to be identical when you have a random intercepts model. There's going to be some deviation there with random coefficients because random slopes make everything a little more complicated, which is why I think it's nice to see this with the random intercepts model. But all of the stuff that we've talked about still, like, holds true, right? Just random coefficients just make everything a little more complicated. But notice that, look at that, they're spot on. Now, why are these two different? Tell me why, you can leave, otherwise you're here forever. Why are these two different? This is now 3A and 3B where I add the cluster means back in. Can anybody see why these are different? How that kind of all works?
One centered SES.
Remember what we said about contextual effects? Right? Do you remember about contextual effects? I said when you grand mean center, this is the gamma naught 1, is going to be the contextual effect. It's the effect of school mean SES on the school mean math achievement, but hold it like after controlling for SES. So this gives me the contextual effect, right? Why this isn't working? I don't know, but this right here is the contextual effect, 3.68. Notice over here, I said the contextual effect is. Remember, I said the contextual effect is the between coefficient minus the within coefficient. Remember that? So look, 5.87 is the between coefficient. That's the between school effect of SES on math achievement. 2.19 is the within school effect of SES on math achievement. Uh-oh, now what do I do? Where? It's horrible. I don't know what I did either. It's like, yeah, it's time to go. And then notice. Oh, did I lose it all? Oh, we're only at line 300. Okay, hold on. Wait a minute. That's not even the right one. That's what I did.
You just switched.
Okay, there we go. I switched markdown files. So if you, while I was freaking out, notice, take 5.87 minus 2.19. What does that give you? 3.68, right? So just like I was saying, remember I said that the contextual effect is like the between effect minus the within effect? Again, this works out perfectly with random intercepts, a little like mushier, not quite so nice when you have random coefficients because random slopes make everything different, but it'll be close. It'll be real close. But here you can see they're identical. And also notice that these aren't standard deviation units, but I get the same estimates. For my variance components, again, with the random intercepts model, they'll be identical. And I get the same estimates for my deviance. So like in a random intercepts model, these two models are actually statistically equivalent. And the only difference is that in one model, I get basically the within effect and the contextual effect. And in the other model, I get the within effect and the between effect. And I can get the contextual effect by subtracting one from the other.
So Betsy, just to clarify, the Remel, like where it says Remel on there.
Yeah, where it
the
says
line.
Remel is deviance, and technically you shouldn't be looking at the Remel deviances to compare models that differ in their fixed effects. But so we should really run the ANOVA. Well, actually, we can't compare those. But all right, if we wanted to compare, let's say model 2B and B, I could run that. I've got the code right there. I could run over, where is it? Okay. Squared. Over.
Oh, it's way past 3D and 4D.
Model. Well, here, let's
I
just
don't
do
think
this.
we do it.
3A and just 2A and 3A. 2A and 3A, right? So if I run the model to compare like 3A and 2A, remember that they're just different because I added mean SES in as a fixed effect. So 3A has 5 parameters, I add 1 fixed effect. I can compare and actually model that includes mean SES fits better because this is statistically significant. I always favor the model that's more complex. When this comparison is not statistically significant, I favor the more parsimonious model. And the logic there is like, hey, if the models fit equally well, I should take the simpler model. If one model, if the more complicated model fits better, then I should take the more complicated model. So you can see here the chi-square difference is 77.2, and that is statistically significant. So that would say, hey, you should put mean SES in there, which makes sense, right? And then the other thing to notice is these deviances would be different from the deviances that you got before. And you might not have noticed it, but somewhere it like flashed on here that it was recomputing the deviances based on FIML. So whenever you run ANOVA, it always like, we'll talk more about that with model fit next week. You don't have to know that, but like these are not going to be the same numbers because these are the deviances computed with FIML, and you just get the Reynolds model, unless you say you want to run the model with FIML. I know I'm way over time, so I'm going to stop there, and I will see you all next week.
Homework's due tomorrow by 5.
Yeah, homework 1. What?
Homework 1.
Homework 1. We're really still only on the first homework. I feel like we've done a lot already. Homework 1 due tomorrow by 5. Homework due next Thursday by 5.
Yes. And it should be posted right now. It should have just appeared when the clock hit noon. Oh, yeah.
Oops.
He knows
Well, he
it.
wanted it to be like Wednesday afternoon. Recording. As I like to.